Just as my mother-in-law was heading over to the couple to retrieve the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed, tumbling out of his chair. Everyone's attention immediately shifted to him. He clutched his stomach, clearly in significant pain. "What's wrong?" someone asked, concern etched on their face. Amidst the commotion, my father-in-law managed to utter something that took me by surprise. "I only had a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I caught my mother-in-law's response. "Did you eat some of that?" "I'm Elizabeth, a 20-year-old housewife. My husband Vernon and I married last year. Being the same age, our conversations and values align perfectly, which has made our relationship harmonious. Our love has only deepened since we got married. However, there was one aspect that unsettled me slightly when we first got married. During our visit to my in-laws to offer our wedding greetings, I noticed my mother-in-law's rather traditional perspective. "When you get married, you come to live with us, right?" she had asked as though it were a given. My husband and I responded in unison. "What?" We both had no intention of living with his parents. My husband clarified, "No, we plan to live independently, just the two of us." My mother-in-law's reaction was one of shock. "What? But you're the eldest son." Both my husband and I were taken aback and uncomfortable with her response. Sensing the tension, my father-in-law interjected, "That's an old-fashioned way of thinking. Do whatever you want, Elizabeth and Vernon." While that seemed to settle the matter for the moment, another issue loomed, worsening the atmosphere. Neither my husband nor I had planned a wedding ceremony. We preferred to avoid anything too extravagant and had discussed using the money for travel and other experiences instead. When I informed my parents about our decision, my mother-in-law's face turned a shade of green. "How can you not have a wedding?" My mother-in-law's voice was filled with disbelief. As I mentioned before, she was quite traditional and strongly opposed our decision to skip a wedding. "How will we explain to our relatives that the eldest son isn't having a wedding?" she demanded. To her, the eldest son's wedding was a significant event, and she couldn't accept any deviation from her beliefs. Fortunately, my father-in-law came to our rescue. "None of the relatives really care about the wedding," he said. "They just see it as a chance for a nice meal. In time, they'll forget there wasn't a wedding. If you two decide against it, that's perfectly fine." His understanding and respect for our wishes were a relief, sparing us from having to conform to my mother-in-law's traditional expectations. Despite her disappointment, we went ahead with our plans. We married without a ceremony and began living independently. I embraced my role as a housewife, supporting my husband by handling the daily household tasks. I find joy in preparing lunch and dinner for him, and our life together has been fulfilling and happy. I think it will be even more enjoyable when we have children someday. About 2 months after our marriage, my parents-in-law invited us to visit. Given the previous disagreements with my mother-in-law, we were a bit apprehensive. However, since we hadn't been to their house since our wedding, we decided it was time to go. I braced myself for any lingering hostility from my mother-in-law, but to my surprise, she was nothing but welcoming. "If you have any questions about being a housewife, don't hesitate to ask me," she offered. "I have all kinds of recipes and would be happy to share everything I know." My mother-in-law, who loves cooking, often hosts gatherings for the neighbors. She proudly mentioned that her home parties are quite popular and that she holds them regularly. On this visit, I enjoyed a delicious home-cooked meal prepared by her. Both my father-in-law and mother-in-law were incredibly kind, and I felt reassured. My worries about the past disagreements melted away, and I realized I didn't need to be anxious anymore. I felt reassured, and my husband felt the same way. He believed that visiting his parents occasionally would be no problem. About 3 months later, my in-laws invited us to a dinner party at their house. Given the warm experience we had during our last visit, we were eager to go. When we arrived, my mother-in-law served a meal that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant. My husband praised her cooking enthusiastically. "You're getting better and better," he said. "You didn't make anything like this when I was a kid. This dish is fantastic. Thank you for preparing such amazing food." My mother-in-law beamed with pride at his compliments and encouraged me to eat as much as I wanted. I enjoyed the evening, but later that night, I began to experience a severe stomachache. As I sat in the bathroom, I started to feel faint and weak. "Hey, Elizabeth, are you okay?" My husband's voice seemed to fade as I struggled to stay conscious. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. Apparently, my husband had called an ambulance and I was rushed to the hospital. The doctor couldn't determine the cause of my illness. They ruled out food poisoning and other common issues. The only suspicion I had was that the pasta I had for lunch might have had too much olive oil. I never did find out what caused my illness. After being put on an IV drip and getting some much-needed rest, I felt better. My husband and I went home and went to bed, puzzled by the whole experience. For a while, I was symptom-free, but 2 months later, it happened again. I suddenly felt unwell, and once again, it followed a meal at my in-laws' house. The only common factor was my mother-in-law's cooking. I wondered if her food was somehow spoiled, but my husband, who had eaten the same meal, was perfectly fine. A month later, the same thing happened after another dinner at my in-laws. Concerned, I invited a friend over for lunch to discuss what might be causing this recurring issue. Could it be stress? She suggested. Her comment made me a bit anxious. I had always tried to be trusting and open-minded, but perhaps I had developed some nervousness around my mother-in-law. Plus, getting sick every time we visited her house was becoming a troubling pattern. My husband shared my concern. He suggested we should take a break from visiting my parents-in-law for a while. Though we didn't know the exact cause, it seemed clear that my symptoms were consistently linked to meals at my in-law's house. My husband speculated that it might be related to my mother-in-law's cooking. I began to wonder if that might be the case. Afterward, my mother-in-law reached out several times, inviting us for dinner. My husband consistently declined the invitations, keeping my health in mind. However, we received another invitation for a dinner party that we couldn't easily refuse. My brother-in-law and his wife were coming to my in-laws' house to offer their wedding greetings. Although I was a bit anxious, as I had been feeling better by avoiding my in-laws' house, my husband assured me that I didn't need to eat much if I wasn't up for it. I decided to try to limit my intake as much as possible. On the day of the party, my mother-in-law greeted me with her usual warmth. As long as we engaged in conversation, I felt fine. Maybe it really was something wrong with the food. Later, my brother-in-law and his wife arrived and we had a pleasant chat. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law expertly prepared the dishes and the table began to fill with an array of beautifully presented and delicious-looking food. Despite the appealing presentation and the fact that the food I had sampled so far tasted great, I still couldn't understand why I kept getting sick. As soon as we sat down, my mother-in-law encouraged me to try the food. "Elizabeth, you mentioned you liked this dish, didn't you? I made it especially delicious today, so please try it." I felt uncertain about what to do. Just then, my husband interjected, "Elizabeth isn't feeling her best today, so let her eat what she can manage." My mother-in-law responded with a nonchalant, "Well." My mother-in-law set a small plate with a modest serving in front of me and asked, "This amount should be fine, right?" I was unsure of what to do when my brother-in-law spoke up. "Elizabeth, if you're not feeling well, you don't have to force yourself," he said. "I've already greeted you, so if you're feeling sick, don't hesitate to go home and rest." It turned out my husband had informed his brother and sister-in-law about my situation, and they were both aware of what was happening. Their concern was comforting. Seeing that she couldn't insist I eat, my mother-in-law said, "Well then, I'll pack it up in a Tupperware for you to take home." I was puzzled by her insistence, but I figured if I took it home, I wouldn't have to eat it anyway. I gratefully accepted, saying, "Okay, thank you very much." Just as my mother-in-law went to get the Tupperware, my father-in-law suddenly collapsed and fell from his chair. Everyone turned to see him clutching his stomach in apparent agony. "What's wrong with you?" someone asked. He hadn't even touched the food on the table yet. "What in the world is going on?" My father-in-law then said something that took us by surprise. "I just had a little bit of food from the kitchen. Why is my stomach suddenly upset?" I heard my mother-in-law's anxious response, "Did you eat some of that?" Without hesitation, my husband called for an ambulance. My mother-in-law accompanied my father-in-law to the hospital, leaving us in a state of shock at their house. I kept thinking about her earlier comment and realized that my brother-in-law's wife might have experienced something similar. "We should investigate the kitchen," I suggested, suspecting there might be a hidden issue. We went to the kitchen where my mother-in-law had been preparing the food and found something alarming. We immediately drove to the hospital where my father-in-law had been taken. At the reception desk, we learned which room he was in and went straight there. As we entered, we heard the doctor asking my mother-in-law if she had any idea what was wrong with her husband. She claimed she knew nothing about it. When we walked into the room, my mother-in-law looked flustered. "Oh, you all came here," she said, trying to dismiss our concerns. "It's all right. As long as I'm here, everything will be fine." But we were determined not to let this opportunity slip by. "I need to talk to you," I said firmly, walking up to her with my husband, brother-in-law, and his wife following. "What is wrong with you all?" I demanded. My father-in-law's condition had stabilized somewhat, and his complexion looked better, but the cause of his distress was still unknown. Apparently, he had been conscious for a while after arriving at the hospital. But after multiple trips to the bathroom, he became severely dehydrated and lost consciousness. I looked my mother-in-law straight in the eye, took something out of my bag, and held it up for her to see. When she saw it, her face turned pale. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. "Did well, what is it?" she stammered, feigning ignorance. "This is a laxative," I said. I couldn't understand why there were so many powdered laxatives in the kitchen. My mother-in-law fell silent at my discovery. The doctor, examining the situation, said, "It appears your father-in-law's symptoms were caused by ingesting a large amount of laxative. We'll run some tests to confirm. If we find evidence of laxatives, we'll need to ask him when he ingested them. If he doesn't know, it means someone else intentionally administered them, which could lead to charges of injury." My mother-in-law's face went pale with panic. "No, it's not like that," she stammered. "I didn't try to make him eat that food. It was just negligence." My husband, visibly upset, pressed her. "Then who were you trying to feed this to?" "It's not." My mother-in-law began to protest, but her voice faltered. "If you won't tell us, we'll have to involve the police and have them investigate," my husband said firmly. Realizing she had no other option, my mother-in-law confessed. "All right, I'll tell you. It was meant for Elizabeth. I intended to punish her by putting laxatives in her meal." "Punish me? What did I ever do to deserve this?" I asked, bewildered. "You're the reason my son has become a bad son," she said bitterly. "You didn't live with us, and you didn't have a wedding. It's all because of you persuading him to make these decisions. You're my enemy." Her resentment seemed unfounded and unjustified. My husband and I looked at each other, appalled. "Is this why you've been putting laxatives in the food I've been eating?" I asked. "It wasn't a lot of laxatives before," my mother-in-law insisted, trying to minimize her actions. "That's why you were fine." "Don't be ridiculous," I retorted. I was rushed to the emergency room. "How can you claim it wasn't a lot?" My husband and brother-in-law echoed my frustration, condemning her actions. "I can't forgive you for what you did to Elizabeth," my husband said angrily. "I'd be furious too if it were my future wife being treated like this." Both my husband and brother-in-law declared that they were disarming my mother-in-law. Her face contorted with fear and desperation as she begged them not to say such things. My father-in-law, who had been semi-conscious throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "You've done a terrible thing out of ego. You should be arrested by the police. I'm deeply disappointed in you." "But even if you say that, you're not divorcing me, are you?" my mother-in-law pleaded. "That's not enough," my father-in-law continued. "You're going to pay Elizabeth $30,000 in damages, and of course you'll need to work for it. I won't be helping you in any way." "No, that's impossible," she cried. "I've been a stay-at-home mom all my life." "Shut up," my father-in-law cut her off. "If you don't accept these terms, I'll divorce you immediately and report you to the police." With no other options, my mother-in-law reluctantly agreed. She began working hard to pay me the $30,000, slowly making payments as she worked through her obligations. My father-in-law keeps a close watch on my mother-in-law to ensure she doesn't try to cheat. All of her salary is being used to pay the damages she owes me, and she looks quite overwhelmed. However, I believe she deserves it for the pain she caused. Meanwhile, my husband and I are living happily. Both my father-in-law and husband assured me that I don't have to see my mother-in-law again, which has brought me a great sense of relief. I know I've been through a lot, but with the support of my husband and father-in-law, I feel confident that I'll be okay no matter what happens. It's shocking to think that feeding someone food laced with laxatives is a criminal act. It seems extreme for a mother-in-law to act so maliciously without hesitation. I often wonder how my father-in-law ended up married to someone like her, though it seems the two sons turned out to be decent individuals. Although the truth of her character remains unclear, the punishment she is receiving feels appropriate. I hope she works hard to repay the $30,000 and that my husband and I continue to live happily ever after.
I used to think our greatest trials were behind us, but it turns out they were just beginning. My name is Helena, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen it all. I've been a nurse for over 30 years, caring for others through their most vulnerable moments. Little did I know, my own life was to be turned upside down. Mom. I don't know how you do it, Martha said, shaking her head in admiration. Working those long shifts at the hospital and still coming home to a clean house and a hot meal. Dad's been such a rock, taking care of everything on the home front. I smiled warmly at my daughter, feeling a surge of gratitude for my husband, Roy. After retiring from his engineering job a few years ago, he had insisted on managing our household so I could focus on my nursing career. Your father has been a godsend, I agreed. I'm not sure I could have kept up this pace without his support. Little did I know, those words would soon come back to haunt me. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone pinged with a notification from our bank. Unusual activity on our account. Frowning, I opened the app, fully expecting it to be a false alarm or a simple mistake. Roy handled all our finances these days, so I hadn't really paid close attention to the statements in quite some time. But as I scrolled through the transactions, my heart began to race. Luxury hotel bookings, expensive restaurant charges, lavish purchases from high-end boutiques, all on dates when Roy claimed to be out volunteering or running errands. Suddenly, his frequent absences from home took on a more sinister hue. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just treating himself after years of hard work and sacrifice. But the dates, the amounts, the patterns, it all pointed to something more insidious. A sickening realization began to take root. My husband, the man I had trusted implicitly for over 40 years, might be betraying me in the cruelest way imaginable. I sat on the edge of our bed, clutching my phone, as a kaleidoscope of emotions swirled within me. Anger, hurt, disbelief, and a creeping sense of determination. I refused to be just another statistic, another woman discarded and disrespected in her later years. No, I would not confront Roy directly. Not yet. I needed proof, a solid foundation to stand on before I made my move. With trembling hands, I began documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained absence. This was just the beginning, but I would get to the bottom of this, no matter how painful the truth might be. One way or another, I would regain control of my life. Roy might have thought he could take advantage of my trust, but he was about to learn just how resilient and resourceful this 62-year-old nurse could be. The next day, I met my dear friend Linda for lunch, as we did every few weeks. Linda and I had been nurses together for years, bonding over the shared challenges and triumphs of our demanding careers. "So how's everything going with you and Jim?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual despite the turmoil brewing inside me. Linda's face lit up with a warm smile. "Oh, it's been wonderful. We're actually planning a little anniversary getaway next month. Jim surprised me with a reservation at that fancy resort up in the mountains. You know, the one with the spa and the incredible views." My heart skipped a beat as she described the very same luxury hotel I had seen charged to our account on a weekend when Roy claimed to be volunteering at the local shelter. I forced a smile, nodding along as Linda gushed about the romantic trip. "That sounds just lovely," I managed to say, my mind racing. "You two deserve some quality time together after all these years." As Linda continued chatting, I found it increasingly difficult to focus on her words. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed made my stomach churn. Roy's frequent absences, the unexplained charges, the fancy hotel getaway, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. My husband was having an affair. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. In the privacy of the stall, I allowed the tears to flow, my body shaking with a potent mix of heartbreak and rage. How could he do this to me, to our family, after everything we'd been through together? But even as the pain threatened to consume me, a steely resolve took root. I would not be a victim in this story. Roy might have thought he could deceive me, but he was gravely mistaken. I would gather the evidence, make a plan, and when the time was right, I would strike back with a vengeance he never saw coming. Splashing some water on my face, I took a deep breath and rejoined Linda, putting on my best poker face. I couldn't let on that anything was amiss, not until I had everything in place. For now, I would play along, all the while plotting my next move. Over the following weeks, I became a master of deception, matching Roy's lies with my own carefully crafted facade. Whenever he mentioned his volunteer nights, I would simply nod and smile, and making no indication that I suspected the truth. All the while, I was meticulously documenting his movements, tracking his expenditures, and gathering the proof I would need to bring his house of cards crashing down. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. Not just at Roy, but at myself for being so blind, for trusting him so completely. But that anger fueled my determination. I was done being the naive, trusting wife. It was time to show Roy and the world just how strong and resilient this 62-year-old woman could be. With each passing day, the evidence against Roy mounted, and my determination grew stronger. I knew I needed irrefutable proof of his betrayal before I could take any decisive action. So one morning, I called in sick to the hospital and set my plan in motion. I tracked Roy's movements from the moment he left the house, maintaining a safe distance to avoid detection. He went about his usual routine, running errands and grabbing lunch at a local diner, giving no outward indication that anything was amiss. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Finally, in the early evening, Roy's car pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant in the city's affluent district. My heart pounded as I watched him exit the vehicle and straighten his jacket, clearly preparing for a special occasion. This had to be it, the moment I had been dreading, yet simultaneously longing for. Slipping into the restaurant through a side entrance, I found a secluded spot where I could observe without being seen. And there he was, my husband of over 40 years, greeting a strikingly beautiful woman with a warm embrace. The way they held each other, the familiarity of their movements, left no doubt in my mind. This was Roy's mistress. I felt the air leave my lungs as a tidal wave of emotions crashed over me. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, it was all I could do to remain composed and focused on my mission. Steadying my trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and began snapping photos, documenting the intimate interactions between Roy and his lover. As they were seated at their table, I studied the woman's face, committing every detail to memory. She couldn't have been more than 45, with long, chestnut hair and a radiant smile that seemed to captivate Roy completely. I watched, sickened, as he gazed at her with an adoration I hadn't seen from him in years. The hours ticked by excruciatingly slowly as they lingered over their meal, laughing and touching in ways that made my stomach churn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they rose to leave, sharing one last passionate kiss before parting ways. I followed at a safe distance, my mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions and a burning desire for vengeance. Once Roy returned home, I retreated to my car, the weight of the evening's revelations threatening to crush me. But even as the tears streamed down my face, I refused to surrender to despair. No, this was merely the first step in my quest for justice. With a steadying breath, I reviewed the damning photos, letting the evidence of Roy's deceit fuel the fire burning within me. He might have thought he could carry on this sordid affair indefinitely, but he was gravely mistaken. I was just getting started. From that moment on, there was no turning back. I would uncover every last detail of Roy's betrayal, gathering the ammunition I needed to bring his world crashing down around him. He had made the grave error of underestimating me, and he would soon learn just how devastating the consequences could be. With the damning evidence of Roy's affair burning a hole in my pocket, I knew I needed to take the next step. I couldn't do this alone. Not only for emotional support, but to ensure I covered all my bases legally and financially. This was a battle I intended to win. I reached out to my younger sister, Patricia, a retired teacher whose wisdom and level-headedness had always been a guiding force in my life. We met for coffee at a quiet cafe, and as soon as she saw my face, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Helena, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. Taking a deep breath, I laid everything out for her. The suspicious charges, the luxury getaways, and finally the incriminating photos of Roy with his mistress. Patricia's eyes widened in disbelief as the truth sank in. "That lying, cheating snake," she hissed, her usual calm demeanor giving way to righteous anger on my behalf. "After everything you've done for him, for your family?" I nodded, fighting back tears as the weight of Roy's betrayal threatened to crush me once more. "I don't know how long this has been going on, or how deep the deception runs, but I can't confront him yet, not until I have an airtight plan in place." Patricia reached across the table, taking my hand in hers with a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, sis. That bastard doesn't deserve a woman like you. We'll take him for everything he's worth, and then some." Over the next few weeks, Patricia became my co-conspirator, my rock in the storm of turmoil that had upended my life. Together, we strategized, considering every possible angle and outcome. We knew there would be fallout, both emotionally and financially, but our primary concern was protecting my career and ensuring Martha's life wasn't disrupted more than necessary. With Patricia's guidance, I began meticulously documenting every shred of evidence against Roy, from bank statements to phone records. I also reached out to an old friend, Caroline, whose savvy business acumen and extensive connections would prove invaluable in the battles to come. "Don't worry, Helena," Caroline assured me during one of our clandestine meetings. "We'll make sure you get everything you're entitled to, and then some. Roy won't know what hit him." As the pieces fell into place, I felt a sense of empowerment slowly replacing the despair that had threatened to consume me. Roy might have thought he could discard me like yesterday's trash, but he was sorely mistaken. I was a woman reborn, fueled by a burning desire for justice and retribution. No more would I be the meek, trusting wife, blindly following her husband's lead. From now on, I would be the master of my own destiny, and Roy would pay dearly for his transgressions. With Patricia and my friends by my side, I was ready to wage war, and I didn't intend to lose. With Patricia and Caroline's support, I began laying the groundwork for my grand exit strategy. Every move had to be calculated, every contingency accounted for. Roy couldn't be allowed to gain the upper hand, not for a single moment. At home, I maintained a careful facade of normalcy, greeting Roy with a warm smile and engaging in our usual routines. All the while, I was slowly packing away essentials, organizing important documents, and transferring what assets I could into secure accounts he couldn't access. My friends at the hospital proved invaluable allies, helping me secure a new living arrangement and offering emotional support during those long, sleepless nights. I'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let Roy's deception derail my career or my financial security. With each passing day, the deception weighed more heavily on my conscience, but I refused to falter, drawing strength from the memories of the life Roy and I had built together, a life he had so callously discarded for his own selfish desires. Finally, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Roy announced he would be volunteering for a long weekend, no doubt squandering our hard-earned money on another lavish rendezvous with his mistress. As I wished him a safe trip, feigning cheerful ignorance, a surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. This was it, the moment I had been meticulously preparing for. The second Roy's car pulled out of the driveway, Patricia and I sprang into action. We worked with military precision, swiftly packing the essentials and loading them into her car. Every box, every bag represented another piece of my life being reclaimed from the wreckage of Roy's betrayal. With the practical matters handled, I turned my attention to the emotional side of my grand exit. I gathered Roy's most prized possessions. The vintage watch I'd gifted him on our 25th anniversary, the framed photos from our dream vacation in Italy, even his beloved recliner, and arranged them in the center of the living room. Then I laid out the evidence of his infidelity, bank statements, phone records, and most damningly, the incriminating photos of him with his mistress. I wanted him to see, with crystal clarity, the depth of his transgressions laid bare before him. Finally, I penned a letter, pouring out my anguish and my resolve in equal measure. "Roy," I wrote, my hand trembling with a potent mix of sorrow and rage. "For over 40 years, I gave you everything, my love, my loyalty, my unwavering support, and you repaid me with deceit and disrespect, shattering the sacred vows we made before God." I took a deep, steadying breath, steeling my nerves for the words that would sever our once unbreakable bond. I deserve better than to be cast aside like an old, worn-out relic. I deserve a partner who cherishes me, who values the life we built together. Clearly, you are no longer that man. So I'm leaving, Roy. Leaving you to the wreckage of your own making. Don't try to find me. Just know that you brought this upon yourself and upon us. With those parting words, I sealed the letter, placing it atop the stack of evidence like a damning verdict. My message was clear. The jig was up, and there would be no second chances. Hand in hand with Patricia, I took one last look around the home that had once represented my hopes and dreams. Then, with my head held high and my spirit fortified by an unshakable resolve, I walked out the door, slamming it shut on that chapter of my life once and for all. The calm before the storm had passed. Now the real battle was about to begin. The day had finally arrived, the day I would sever ties with Roy and reclaim my life once and for all. As he prepared to leave for his supposed volunteer weekend, I fought to maintain my composure, greeting him with a warm smile that betrayed none of the turmoil churning within me. "Have a great trip," I said, pressing a tender kiss to his cheek. "I'll miss you, but I know how important this work is to you." Roy beamed, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to come crashing down around him. "I'll be back before you know it, dear. Love you." With those parting words, he was gone, driving off to pursue his sordid affair while I put the final phases of my plan into motion. The second his car disappeared from sight, Patricia arrived, her face set in a determined expression that matched my own resolve. "Ready, sis?" she asked, pulling up to the curb. I nodded, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "More than ready. Let's do this." We worked with machine-like efficiency, swiftly loading every essential item into Patricia's car: clothes, personal mementos, important documents. With each box I carried out of that house, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, as if I were shedding the shackles of Roy's deception one by one. As we stripped the home bare, I couldn't help but reflect on the decades of memories contained within those walls. The joyous celebrations, the hard-won triumphs, the quiet moments of domestic bliss. So much of my life had been interwoven with Roy's, and now I was cutting those threads forever. But rather than despair, I found strength in those recollections. They reminded me of the woman I had been before Roy's betrayal, strong, resilient, devoted. I had built this life from the ground up, and I would be damned if I let him take that away from me. With the practical matters handled, I turned my attention to one final, deeply symbolic act. I gathered Roy's most prized possessions, the ones that had once held such sentimental value, and arranged them in the center of our now barren living room. The vintage watch, the framed photos, the well-worn recliner, all laid out like an effigy of the life we had once shared. Atop that pile, I placed the evidence of his transgressions: bank statements, phone records, and those damning photos that had set this entire upheaval in motion. I wanted him to see, in no uncertain terms, the depth of his betrayal and the price he would pay for it. Finally, I penned a letter, pouring out my anguish and my resolve in equal measure. "You made your choices, Roy," I wrote, my hand trembling with a potent mix of heartache and rage. "And now you'll have to live with the consequences." With those parting words, I sealed the envelope, placing it atop the stack of evidence like a damning verdict. My message was clear. Our marriage was over, and there would be no second chances. Hand in hand with Patricia, I took one last look around the hollow shell that had once been my home. Then, with my head held high and my spirit fortified by an unshakable resolve, I walked out that door, slamming it shut on that chapter of my life once and for all. In that moment, I felt a surge of power and liberation unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Roy might have thought he could discard me like an old, worn-out relic, but he was gravely mistaken. I was just getting started. When Roy returned home from his supposed volunteer trip that weekend, I can only imagine the shock and confusion that must have washed over him. As he pulled into the driveway, the house appeared perfectly normal from the outside. But the moment he stepped through the front door, his world came crashing down around him. The home we had shared for decades was stripped bare, every trace of my existence carefully removed. In the center of the barren living room lay a tableau that must have chilled him to the bone, his most prized possessions arranged like an effigy, topped with the damning evidence of his infidelity. bank statements, phone records, and those incriminating photos of him and his mistress, Lisa, stared back at him like a lurid accusation. And there, atop the pile, was my letter. A final, devastating proclamation that our marriage was over for good. I can only imagine the panic that must have seized him in those first few moments, the desperate confusion as he tried to make sense of the situation. His frantic calls to my phone went unanswered, of course, only adding to his growing desperation. Perhaps he thought I would eventually come to my senses, that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with pretty words and empty promises. But as the hours ticked by and the reality of my absence sank in, the true weight of my actions must have hit him like a ton of bricks. Not only had I left him, but I had done so with a meticulous strategic precision that left him utterly powerless. The realization that I had been quietly gathering evidence and making preparations right under his nose, well, that had to sting in a way few betrayals could. In his desperation, I'm sure Roy reached out to Lisa, the woman for whom he had so callously discarded our marriage. But she, too, had faced the fallout of my carefully orchestrated revenge. With the evidence of their affair laid bare, her own life had been thrown into turmoil, thus leaving Roy well and truly alone to contend with the consequences of his actions. As the hours stretched into days, the isolation and shame must have weighed heavily upon him. This was no longer just a matter of a broken marriage. This was a personal hell of his own making, a purgatory crafted by the very woman he had so grievously underestimated. With each passing moment, I imagine Roy's mind replaying every interaction, every lie, every deception that had led to this moment. The years of memories we had shared, the life we had built together, all tainted by the bitter truth of his betrayal. And through it all, the damning evidence of his misdeeds stared back at him, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his indiscretions. My letter, that final proclamation of freedom and resolve, must have felt like a dagger to his heart, twisting with every rereading. "You made your choices, Roy," I had written, my words carrying the weight of a life's worth of pain and disappointment. "And now you'll have to live with the consequences." For a man who had once held such power and control, the utter helplessness of his situation must have been a bitter pill to swallow. He had gambled everything on his ability to deceive me. And in the end, he had lost it all, his marriage, his dignity, and any semblance of the life he had once known. As for me, well, I had emerged from the ashes of our broken union like a phoenix reborn, stronger and more resilient than ever before. Roy's world might have been crumbling around him, but mine was just beginning anew, a life free from the shackles of his lies, a future forged on my own terms. And if he thought this was the end, that I would simply fade away into obscurity, well, he was about to learn just how mistaken he truly was. In the aftermath of my daring escape from Roy's web of lies, Patricia became my rock, my safe harbor in the storm. With a heavy heart, but an indomitable spirit, I moved in with her temporarily as I set about rebuilding my life from the ashes of our shattered marriage. Those first few nights, as the weight of everything I had endured came crashing down around me, Patricia and I would stay up late into the evening, sharing stories and shedding tears of both sorrow and relief. She had been my co-conspirator, my partner in crime, and now she was my shoulder to lean on as I navigated this new, uncertain path. "I'm so proud of you, sis," she would say, squeezing my hand reassuringly. "Roy never deserved a woman as strong and resilient as you." Her words, though simple, carried a profound weight, reminding me of the unbreakable bond we shared as sisters. A bond that had seen us through countless trials and tribulations over the years. We might have been separated by a few years in age, but in that moment, we were united as true equals, warriors who had stared down adversity and emerged victorious. As the days turned to weeks, Patricia and I began the process of finding me a new home. A sanctuary where I could start fresh, free from the ghosts of Roy's betrayal. We scoured listings, attended open houses, and eventually we found the perfect place. A cozy little bungalow with a beautiful garden out back, just waiting to be brought back to life. Moving into that new space, I felt a profound sense of rebirth wash over me. These walls held no echoes of the past, no lingering memories of the life I had once shared with Roy. This was my clean slate, my chance to redefine myself on my own terms. Slowly but surely, I began settling into a new routine, balancing my work at the hospital with the task of turning my house into a home. With each personal touch I added, each cherished memento I unpacked, I felt a little more of the weight lifting from my shoulders. My friends from work rallied around me, offering support and understanding in a way only those who had witnessed my turmoil could. They celebrated my newfound freedom, marveling at the strength it must have taken to orchestrate such a daring escape. And then there was Martha. My beautiful, resilient daughter had been kept largely in the dark about the true depths of Roy's deception, but when she learned the truth, she didn't hesitate to throw her support behind me wholeheartedly. "Mom, I'm just so sorry you had to go through all that," she said, tears shining in her eyes as we embraced. "But I'm in awe of your courage and your strength. You're an inspiration." Her words, spoken with such pure admiration and love, were like a soothing balm on the still raw wounds of my heart. In that moment, I realized that while Roy might have shattered our family's foundation, the bonds that truly mattered, the ones between mother and daughter, sister and sister, remained unbroken, fortified by a love and respect that transcended any one person's actions. As the weeks turned to months, I found myself settling into a new normal, one defined not by the shackles of Roy's betrayal, but by the empowering freedom of choosing my own path. Each morning I would wake up in my little bungalow, surrounded by the reminders of the life I had so bravely claimed for myself, and I would feel a surge of pride and contentment. This was my life now, a life forged in the fires of heartbreak and deception, but ultimately tempered into something stronger, more resilient, and more authentically mine than ever before. Roy might have thought he could break me, but in the end, he had only succeeded in unlocking a wellspring of inner strength I never knew I possessed. And as I looked ahead to the future, I did so with a renewed sense of purpose and a profound gratitude for the incredible network of women who had rallied around me. My sister, my daughter, my friends. Their love and support had been the light that guided me through my darkest days, and it was that same light that would continue to illuminate my path forward, come what may. I found this crumpled note under your pillow. What does "I can't go on like this" mean, Ben? My husband froze, his eyes wide like a deer in headlights. After 30 years of marriage, I knew every nuance of his expression. The slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his brow furrowed ever so slightly, he was hiding something from me. "It's nothing, Ava, just some nonsense I scribbled down." Ben snatched the note from my hand, crumpling it further in his fist. I crossed my arms, my heart pounding. "Don't lie to me. We promised each other no more secrets, remember?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "You're right, I'm sorry. It's just—" He trailed off, averting his gaze. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tensions. I thought of our 2 grown children, Lila and Jessie, both out on their own now. Had our family become so fractured without me realizing? "Ben, talk to me," I pleaded, my voice catching in my throat. "Whatever it is, we can work through it together." He looked up at me then, his eyes brimming with a sadness I hadn't seen in years. "I don't know if we can, Ava. I've been feeling so trapped, like I'm living someone else's life." His words felt like a physical blow. We'd built this life together, a life centered around his family's hardware store and the home we'd made for our children. How could he feel trapped in the very existence he'd chosen? "What are you saying?" I asked, my hands trembling. "Are you unhappy with me? With us?" Ben reached for me, but I stepped back, my mind reeling. "It's not about you, Ava. It's about me and the choices I've made, the dreams I've let slip away." I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. We'd weathered so many storms together, only for him to crumble under the weight of some midlife crisis. But as I looked at my husband, truly looked at him, I saw the deep lines etched into his face, the weariness in his eyes. This was a man struggling under the burden of regrets and unfulfilled desires. In that moment, I realized our marriage had become a battlefield, with casualties on both sides. We'd been so focused on raising our children, on maintaining the status quo, that we'd lost sight of each other's needs. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Okay, Ben, I hear you. But we can't fix this if you don't let me in. No more secrets, remember?" He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with relief. "You're right. I owe you the truth." As he began to speak, I braced myself for the impact of his words, knowing that our lives were about to change forever. Ben's confession hung heavy in the air between us. I felt like I was suffocating, gasping for breath as the weight of his words threatened to crush me. "You're feeling trapped?" I echoed, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What about me, Ben? Have you ever stopped to consider how I might feel, living under the same roof as your mother?" Eleanor. Just the thought of her name made my blood boil. From the moment she'd moved in after her knee surgery, she'd made my life a living hell. Her constant criticism, her blatant favoritism towards Ben, it was like she took perverse pleasure in belittling me at every turn. "Mom's just set in her ways," Ben said weakly, as if that excused her behavior. "You know how she is." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Yes, I know exactly how she is. She's a manipulative, controlling woman who has never accepted me as part of this family." Ben opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't try to defend her, Ben. Not after everything she's put me through." Memories flooded my mind unbidden. Eleanor's snide remarks about my cooking, her disdainful looks whenever I tried to assert myself. And through it all, Ben had stood by, either oblivious or unwilling to confront his precious mother. "Do you remember our anniversary dinner last year?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "How she criticized the way I'd set the table, made snide comments about the food I'd spent hours preparing?" Ben's face fell, and I knew he remembered. It had been one of the worst nights of my life, a supposed celebration turned into a humiliating ordeal. "And what did you do?" I pressed on, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You just sat there, letting her tear me down in front of our own children." Lila and Jessie, bless them, had tried to come to my defense that night, but their efforts had only earned them Eleanor's wrath, further fracturing our already strained family dynamics. "I'm sorry, Ava," Ben said, his voice heavy with remorse. "I should have stood up for you, for all of us, but you know how my mother can be." "No, Ben," I cut him off sharply. "I don't want to hear excuses anymore. Not when you've let her walk all over me for years." I thought back to the early days of our marriage, when Ben and I had been so deliriously happy. We'd had our whole lives ahead of us, full of promise and possibility. But somewhere along the way that spark had dimmed, smothered by the weight of Eleanor's constant presence and Ben's complacency. "Do you remember our trip to Napa Valley?" I asked, a wistful smile tugging at my lips despite the pain in my heart. "We were so young and carefree, dreaming of all the adventures we'd have together." Ben's expression softened, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Of course I remember. Those were some of the happiest days of my life." "What happened to us, Ben?" I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion. "Where did that happiness go?" He reached for my hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know, Ava, but I want to find it again, with you. I want us to be a team, like we used to be." I searched his face, desperate to believe his words, to trust that he truly meant them. But the shadow of Eleanor's influence loomed large, a constant reminder of the forces working against us. As I looked into Ben's eyes, I knew that our journey back to happiness would be long and arduous. But for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a determination to reclaim the life and love we'd once shared, no matter what obstacles stood in our way. The weeks following Ben's confession were a whirlwind of emotion. As much as I wanted to believe his promises of change, the sting of his betrayal lingered like a persistent ache. It started with little things: a lingering glance when a woman walked by, a secretive smile as he checked his phone. At first I brushed it off, desperate to cling to the hope that we could salvage our marriage. But then came the late nights at the hardware store, the flimsy excuses about inventory checks and supplier meetings. I knew in my gut that something was amiss, but I was too afraid to confront the truth. That all changed the day Marie Wilkins walked back into our lives. I'll never forget the moment I saw her standing in our driveway, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer clothes a stark contrast to my rumpled house dress. She looked every bit the successful businesswoman she'd become, her confidence radiating like a force field. "Ava," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "It's been too long." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Marie had been Ben's high school sweetheart, the one he'd pined over before settling down with me. And now, after all these years, she was back in our lives like a specter from the past. "What are you doing here?" I managed to ask, my heart pounding in my chest. Marie's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm back in town for good, and I thought I'd stop by and say hello to an old friend." An old friend. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Ben's distant behavior, his late nights, the guilty looks he'd been giving me. "You've been seeing my husband?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. To her credit, Marie didn't try to deny it. "Ben and I have reconnected, yes, but it's not what you think, Ava. We're just old friends catching up, reminiscing about the past." I wanted to scream, to lash out at this woman who had so casually waltzed back into our lives and upended everything. But deep down, I knew the blame lay squarely on Ben's shoulders. When he finally came home that evening, I confronted him head-on. "Marie stopped by today," I said, watching as the color drained from his face. Ben opened his mouth, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't bother lying to me, Ben. I know you've been seeing her behind my back." For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But then, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been meeting up with Marie, trying to recapture some of the excitement from our youth." The admission hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. All this time, while I'd been trying to salvage our marriage, he'd been indulging in some twisted midlife crisis. "How could you do this to me, Ben?" I asked, my voice thick with tears. "After everything we've been through together, how could you betray me like this?" He reached for me, but I recoiled from his touch. "Ava, please let me explain." But I didn't want to hear his excuses, his justifications. In that moment, all I felt was a profound sense of betrayal, a realization that the man I'd loved and trusted for decades had been living a lie. As I looked at Ben, I saw a stranger, a man consumed by his own selfish desires, willing to sacrifice everything we'd built for a fleeting taste of his past. And in that moment, I knew that our marriage, our family, had been irrevocably shattered. The only question that remained was whether we had the strength to pick up the pieces and rebuild from the rubble. The weeks following Ben's confession were a whirlwind of emotion. As much as I wanted to believe his promises of change, the sting of betrayal lingered like a persistent ache. We tried to move forward, to rebuild the tattered remnants of our marriage, but a palpable tension hung in the air. Ben's words of reassurance felt hollow, and I found myself questioning every gesture, every glance. It all came to a head during a family dinner when Lila and Jessie joined us. I'd hoped that their presence might help bridge the growing divide between Ben and me, but little did I know it would only serve to widen the chasm. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk," Lila began, her expression a mix of concern and determination. Ben and I exchanged a glance, and I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the moment we'd find our way back to each other, to the love that had once bound us so tightly. But then Eleanor opened her mouth and everything unraveled. "Your father and I have been discussing his little indiscretion," she said, her words laced with venom. "And I, for one, think it's time he put an end to this nonsense with that woman." I felt the air leave my lungs, a sickening realization dawning. Eleanor knew about Ben's affair with Marie, and she was using it as ammunition in her never-ending quest to control our family. "Mom, stop," Ben warned, but Eleanor barreled on, her gaze fixed on me. "You've been so focused on your own hurt, Ava, that you've neglected your duties as a wife and mother." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the familiar tendrils of shame and inadequacy wrapping around me. But this time, something was different. This time I had an ally. "That's enough, Grandma." Lila spoke up, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You have no right to speak to Mom like that." Eleanor turned on her, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you take her side, after everything she's done to tear this family apart?" "She's not the one who betrayed Dad," Jessie chimed in, his jaw set in a defiant line. "That was you, Grandma, and him." The words hung in the air, a damning indictment of the fractures that had formed in our once tight-knit family. I looked at Ben, silently pleading for him to take a stand, to choose us over the toxic influence of his mother. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table, a myriad of emotions flickering across his face. In that moment, I knew that our marriage had reached a breaking point. The betrayal, the lies, the constant manipulation, it had all become too much to bear. And as much as I loved Ben, as much as I wanted to believe in the promises of change, I knew that we couldn't move forward until we confronted the source of our turmoil head-on. "Ben," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of sadness and resolve, "we can't go on like this. Something has to change." He looked up at me, and I saw the weight of the world in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement passed between us, a recognition that our family was fracturing, and we had to make a choice. As I looked around the table at the strained expressions on Lila and Jesse's faces, at the defiant tilt of Eleanor's chin, I knew that this was the moment that would define our future. We could either crumble under the weight of our dysfunction, or we could rise above it, reclaiming the love and strength that had once bound us together. The choice was ours to make, and in that moment, I knew that I had to be the one to take the first step. The decision to leave my home, my life as I knew it, was one of the most difficult choices I've ever had to make. But in the aftermath of Ben's betrayal, I knew that I couldn't stay trapped in that suffocating existence any longer. I had to find a way to breathe again, to reclaim some semblance of dignity. That's how I found myself taking the leap, accepting a full-time position at the community center. It was a chance to immerse myself in a new world, one where I could rediscover my sense of purpose and self-worth. The work was demanding, but it gave me a renewed sense of accomplishment that had been missing from my life for far too long. In the months that followed, I found myself becoming a part of a vibrant community of women, each of us seeking solace in the shared bonds of our newfound independence. We would gather after our shifts, sharing stories over glasses of wine, and forming a sisterhood stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. It was there, among that circle of kindred spirits, that I first felt the stirrings of a long-forgotten dream. A dream that had been buried beneath years of domestic drudgery and the relentless demands of keeping a home. A dream that had once filled me with a sense of purpose and possibility. What if, I mused aloud one evening, as my new friends listened with rapt attention, what if I finally pursued that degree I'd always longed for? The idea took root, blossoming into a plan that would allow me to reclaim a piece of the identity I'd lost. With a newfound determination, I enrolled in the local community college, taking night classes that would finally allow me to achieve the dream I'd abandoned so many years ago. Suddenly, a whole new world opened up before me, a world where I could finally put my passions to use, where I could build a life on my own terms. It was a revelation that filled me with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. As the months passed, my confidence grew. I found myself thriving in my new role, embracing the challenges that came with juggling work and school. And with each accomplishment, each new milestone, I felt the shackles of my former life slip away. My new friends cheered me on, celebrating each small victory with me over glasses of wine that grew cheaper by the day. They became my tribe, a support system that buoyed me through the darkest days when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm me. It was through their encouragement that I finally decided to take the leap and apply to the local university to complete my degree. A dream I had long since abandoned finally became a reality, and with it, a new path opened up before me. In that moment, I knew that I had reclaimed a piece of myself that had been missing for far too long. A piece that had been slowly chipped away by the demands of keeping a home, of being a provider. The possibility of what my life could become filled me with a sense of hope and possibility I hadn't felt in years. That night, as I poured myself a glass of the cheapest wine I could find, I raised a toast to my newfound independence. A new life was calling, one that was entirely my own. The weight of Eleanor's control over the family had been slowly suffocating me, but with Ava's newfound independence, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that we could forge our own path forward. That's when I knew I had to take a stand against my mother's manipulation, for the sake of my own future, and Ava's. It started with the little things, standing up to Eleanor's criticisms, asserting my own identity. And then as my confidence grew, I began to envision a life without her looming presence, without the weight of her expectations. That's when I made the decision to cut ties with Eleanor, to break free from the cycle of control that had defined our family dynamics for far too long. It was a difficult choice, but one that felt necessary for my own growth and for Ava's sense of self-determination. With a newfound sense of purpose, I took the first steps towards building a life without Eleanor's influence, paving the way for a future where Ava and I could forge our own path together. In that moment, I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but I was ready to face it head-on with Ava by my side. It was a new beginning, a chance to redefine ourselves and our future, free from the burdens of the past. As we moved forward, I felt a sense of excitement and determination, knowing that we were building a life on our own terms, with a foundation of respect and partnership. The weeks following my confrontation with Eleanor were a whirlwind of emotion. Ben and I found ourselves navigating uncharted territory, trying to rebuild the foundations of our marriage on a bedrock of honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't easy. Years of resentment and hurt had taken their toll, leaving deep scars that would take time to heal. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that we could forge a path forward, free from the toxic influence of Eleanor's manipulation. Ben, to his credit, seemed determined to make amends. He was open and remorseful, acknowledging the ways in which he had failed me, failed us, by allowing his mother to wield such control over our lives. "I was weak, Ava," he confessed one night as we sat together on the porch, the cool evening breeze offering a respite from the emotional turmoil we'd been grappling with. "I let her get into my head, and I lost sight of what really mattered." I reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We both made mistakes, Ben. But what matters now is that we're willing to fight for each other, for our family." He nodded, his eyes shining with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes, Ava. No more secrets, no more letting my mother dictate our lives." In the weeks that followed, we worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. We went to counseling, laying bare the wounds that had festered for far too long. And slowly, gradually, we began to find our way back to each other. But just as we were starting to gain our footing, a curveball came hurtling our way, one that threatened to upend everything we'd been working towards. It started with a phone call from the nursing home where Eleanor had been staying. She'd suffered a minor stroke, they told us, and while she was stable, the prognosis was uncertain. Ben was beside himself, torn between the desire to stand by his mother in her time of need and the lingering resentment he felt towards her manipulative ways. "I don't know if I can do this, Ava," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything she's put us through, how can I just show up and pretend like nothing happened?" I understood his hesitation, his anger. Eleanor had inflicted deep wounds on our family, and the scars were still raw. But in that moment, I knew that we had a choice to make. A choice that would define the path forward for all of us. "Ben," I said, taking his hand in mine, "this is your chance to break the cycle, to show Eleanor that you're not going to let her control you anymore, but that you're still willing to be there for her as a son should." He searched my eyes, looking for reassurance, for guidance. And in that moment, I knew that the decision rested squarely on my shoulders. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," I promised. "But think about what kind of man you want to be, what kind of example you want to set for our children and grandchildren." Ben was silent for a long moment, weighing the gravity of the situation. And then, with a deep breath, he made his choice. "I'll go to her," he said, his voice resolute. "But not as the dutiful son she's always expected. I'll go as my own man, on my own terms." As I watched him gather his things, a sense of pride swelled within me. This was the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, a man of strength, of integrity, who was finally ready to forge his own path. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as true partners, united in our determination to build a life defined by love, respect, and the freedom to choose our own destiny. The decision to move Eleanor into a care facility was one of the most difficult choices Ben and I had to make. On one hand, the thought of entrusting her care to strangers felt like a betrayal of the familial bonds that had once held us together. But on the other, the weight of her manipulation and the toll it had taken on our lives was a burden we could no longer bear. In the end, it was a decision born of necessity. A recognition that for our family to truly heal, we needed to establish boundaries and create a space where we could rebuild without the constant specter of Eleanor's influence looming over us. The day we moved her into the facility, a palpable tension hung in the air. Eleanor, ever the master of manipulation, alternated between bouts of feigned frailty and biting remarks, her words aimed like daggers at the heart of our newfound resolve. "You'll regret this," she hissed as Ben and I helped her settle into her new room. "Mark my words, you'll come crawling back begging for my forgiveness." But Ben, to his credit, remained steadfast. "This is for the best, Mother," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that betrayed the depth of his internal struggle. "We all need a chance to start over, to heal." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Start over? You think you can just erase decades of history, of the sacrifices I've made for this family?" I placed a gentle hand on Ben's arm, a silent reminder that we were in this together, united against the forces that had once threatened to tear us apart. "No one is erasing anything, Eleanor," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We're simply creating the space we need to move forward, on our own terms." She scoffed, her disdain palpable. "Your terms? Don't make me laugh. You'll see, Ava. In the end, you'll come crawling back, just like everyone else." With those parting words, she turned away from us, her shoulders hunched in a posture of defiant resignation. It was a bitter farewell, but one that felt strangely liberating. As Ben and I left the facility that day, hand in hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. It was as if a weight had been lifted, a burden we'd been carrying for far too long finally set down. In the weeks and months that followed, we worked tirelessly to rebuild our lives, to forge a path forward that was defined by our own choices, our own desires. Ben visited his mother regularly, but always with a newfound sense of boundaries and self-respect. And slowly, gradually, the fractures that had once threatened to tear our family apart began to heal. Lila and Jessie, inspired by our journey, found their own paths. Lila pursuing her dreams of becoming a chef, Jessie embracing the role of devoted husband and father. And through it all, they remained a constant source of support, a reminder of the unbreakable bonds that had sustained us through even the darkest of times. As for Ben and me, we rediscovered the love that had first brought us together, that had carried us through the challenges and triumphs of decades past. We learned to communicate openly, to navigate the complexities of our relationship with honesty and compassion. And in those quiet moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm us, we would remind each other of the strength we'd found in our journey, the resilience that had carried us through the storm and into the calm waters of a new beginning. "We rebuilt from the ashes," I would whisper to Ben as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. "We're a stronger family now, defined by love and respect." And in those moments, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, united in our determination to forge a life that was truly our own. The envelope sat innocuously on Henry's desk, its crisp white edges a stark contrast against the polished mahogany surface. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly, an inexplicable sense of dread coiling in my stomach. As I slid the letter out, the unmistakable scent of a woman's perfume wafted up, a sickly sweet aroma that made my head spin. "Ruth, darling, what are you doing?" Henry's voice startled me, and I whirled around, the letter clutched in my hand like a damning piece of evidence. "Who is Mary?" I demanded, my voice quivering with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Henry's face paled, and he stumbled back, clutching his chest. "Where did you find that?" he gasped, his eyes wide with panic. I thrust the letter towards him, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In your desk drawer, along with a dozen others. Love letters, Henry? From a woman half your age?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, he doubled over, his face contorted in pain. "Ruth, you have to call an ambulance," he choked out, his fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my ears, a lifetime of resentment and hurt bubbling to the surface. "No, Henry," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You can manage alone, just like you always wanted." His eyes widened in shock, and he reached out a trembling hand towards me. "Ruth, please." But I had already turned away, The letter crumpled in my fist. I strode out of the study, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of our once perfect home. In the kitchen, I poured myself up a glass of wine, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the bottle. I sank into a chair, the cool liquid a welcome balm against the burning rage that consumed me. How could he? After everything we'd been through, after all the sacrifices I'd made for him, for our marriage? I thought back to the early days when his charm and intellect had swept me off my feet. I was a passionate literature teacher then, my life brimming with purpose and dreams. Henry had seemed like the perfect partner, someone who understood and appreciated my love for the arts. We'd spent countless evenings discussing poetry and philosophy, our minds and souls intertwined in a beautiful dance of shared passions. But slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamic had shifted. Henry's ambition had taken precedence, and he'd insisted that I give up my teaching job to support his career. At first, I'd acquiesced, convinced that it was a temporary sacrifice for the greater good of our partnership. How naive I'd been. The years had slipped by, and I'd found myself increasingly isolated, my dreams and aspirations withering away like neglected flowers. Henry's control had tightened, his criticisms and belittling remarks chipping away at my self-worth until I was little more than a shell of my former self. And now this ultimate betrayal. I drained the glass, the wine leaving a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. Enough was enough. I would not be a victim any longer, a mere footnote in the story of Henry's life. It was time to reclaim my narrative, to write a new chapter where I was the author, the master of my own destiny. I squared my shoulders, a newfound resolve coursing through my veins. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in decades I felt alive, a spark of hope igniting within me. Henry could keep his mistress and his lies. I was done playing the role of the dutiful, subservient wife. It was time for Ruth Parker to take center stage. I sank deeper into the plush armchair, cradling the glass of wine like a lifeline as memories flooded my mind. How had it all gone so wrong? The first time I laid eyes on Henry, it was at a community theater production of Shakespeare's Hamlet. I was captivated by his commanding presence on stage, his rich baritone voice resonating through the auditorium. After the show, a group of us had gathered at a local cafe to discuss the performance, and that's when I met him. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on the play. We debated the nuances of Hamlet's character, our words dancing in a delightful tango of intellectual discourse. By the end of the evening, I was smitten. Our courtship was a whirlwind of shared passions and dreams. Henry was pursuing his law degree, and I was a dedicated literature teacher, pouring my heart into shaping young minds. We were kindred spirits, united in our love for the arts and our ambitions. On our wedding day, I remember standing before him, my heart swelling with joy and hope for the future we would build together. His vows promised a partnership of equals, a commitment to supporting each other's aspirations and nurturing our individual growth. Those first few years were blissful. We attended poetry readings and art exhibitions, our conversations flowing like a gentle stream, nourishing our souls. Henry was attentive and supportive, and I basked in the warmth of his affection. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tides began to shift. Henry's career took precedence, and he insisted that I leave my teaching job to focus on supporting his ambitions. At first, I acquiesced, convinced that it was a temporary sacrifice for the greater good of our partnership. "It won't be forever, my love," he had assured me, his eyes shining with ambition. "Once I've established myself, you can pursue your passions again." Foolishly, I believed him. The years trickled by, and my dreams withered like neglected flowers. Henry's control over our lives tightened, his criticisms and belittling remarks chipping away at my self-worth. I became a shadow of my former self, a mere accessory to his success. Whenever I broached the subject of returning to teaching, he would dismiss me with a wave of his hand. "You know how demanding my career is, Ruth. We can't afford any distractions right now." And so I remained trapped, my once vibrant spirit slowly suffocating under the weight of his dominance. It wasn't until Edna, Henry's mother, fell ill that I glimpsed a glimmer of hope. Henry insisted that we move into her home to care for her, and I reluctantly agreed, desperate for any change in my stagnant existence. Edna was a formidable woman, her sharp tongue and critical nature a constant source of tension. But as the months wore on, something unexpected happened. Beneath her prickly exterior, she began to see the genuine kindness and patience I exhibited, qualities that her son seemed to have forgotten. In those rare moments when Henry was absent, Edna and I would share quiet conversations, and a tentative bond formed between us. She saw the toll Henry's neglect and control had taken on me, and her eyes would soften with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You deserve better, my dear," she whispered to me one evening, her frail hands squeezing mine. "Don't let him break your spirit." Her words were like a lifeline, a reminder of the woman I once was, the woman I still longed to be, and then, just like that, she was gone. Edna's passing should have been a relief, a chance to breathe after months of grueling caregiving, but instead it only served to magnify the gaping chasm that had formed between Henry and me. In the aftermath of her death, I found myself adrift, untethered from the fragile bond that had kept me anchored to our crumbling marriage. Henry retreated further into his work, his absence both physical and emotional, leaving me to navigate the turbulent waters alone. It was during this time that the true extent of his control over my life became glaringly apparent. Without Edna's presence, I was left with nothing but the suffocating silence of our once vibrant home, a constant reminder of the dreams I had sacrificed. "Ruth, you know I can't be bothered with trivial matters," Henry would snap whenever I broached the subject of my desires. "My career demands my full attention." His words cut deeper than any knife, stripping away what little self-worth I had left. I was nothing more than a burden, an afterthought in his relentless pursuit of success. Finances were another weapon in his arsenal of dominance. Henry had insisted on handling all our accounts, citing his superior financial acumen as justification. I was left with a meager allowance, just enough to cover basic necessities, while he indulged in extravagances without a second thought. "A woman of your age has no need for such frivolities," he would scoff whenever I expressed a desire for something beyond the bare essentials. His words stung, but I had learned to swallow my pride, to bury my dreams beneath the weight of his contempt. It was during one of our rare evenings together that the final blow came. I had mustered the courage to suggest taking a part-time teaching position at the local community college, a tentative step towards reclaiming a piece of my former self. Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. "Absolutely not," he thundered, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I will not have my wife gallivanting about like some common laborer." I recoiled as if struck, my heart shattering into a million pieces. "But Henry, it's just a few classes," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "It would mean so much to me." He slammed his fist on the table, the force of it rattling the dishes. "Enough! You will do as I say, or there will be consequences." In that moment I saw him for what he truly was, a tyrant, a man so consumed by his own ego that he would crush the very soul of the woman he claimed to love. As he stormed out of the room, I sank to the floor, my body racked with silent sobs. How had I allowed myself to become so diminished, so utterly powerless? It was then that I stumbled upon Edna's letter, tucked away in a drawer, her elegant script a stark contrast to the harsh reality of my life. "My dearest Ruth," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I have departed this world, leaving you to navigate the treacherous waters of my son's selfishness alone." I clutched the letter tightly, my eyes devouring each word as if it were a lifeline. "Henry has become a man I scarcely recognize, consumed by his own ambition and blinded to the beauty and strength that resides within you. You deserve so much more than the gilded cage he has constructed around your spirit." Tears streamed down my face as I read on, Edna's words resonating deep within my soul. "Do not let him break you, my dear. Find the courage to spread your wings and soar, for you were meant for so much more than this half-life of servitude." As I reached the end of the letter, a newfound resolve took root within me. Edna had seen the truth, had recognized the injustice of my situation, and in her final act she had given me the gift of validation. I was not the problem, Henry was, and in that moment I made a vow to myself. No longer would I be a prisoner in my own life. It was time to reclaim my identity, to shed the shackles of Henry's control and embrace the freedom that had been denied to me for far too long. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope ignite within me. I was done being a spectator in my own story. It was time to take center stage. The news of Edna's illness hit like a ton of bricks. Henry's domineering mother had always been a formidable presence in our lives, her sharp tongue and critical nature a constant source of tension. "We'll have to move in with her," Henry announced one evening, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "She'll need round-the-clock care, and I can't be bothered with hiring nurses." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. Henry's mind was made up, as it always was, and my opinion held no weight. Within a matter of weeks, we had packed up our lives and relocated to Edna's sprawling home on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was suffocating, a constant reminder of the sacrifices I had made for this family. Edna's health was rapidly declining, and the burden of her care fell squarely on my shoulders. Henry was rarely present, his work taking precedence over everything else, as usual. "You knew what you were signing up for when you married my son," Edna would sneer, her eyes boring into me with a mixture of disdain and pity. I would bite my tongue, swallowing the retort that threatened to spill forth. What good would it do to argue with this bitter, ailing woman? The days blurred together in a haze of medication schedules, meal preparations, and endless cleaning. Edna was a demanding patient, her sharp tongue lashing out at the slightest perceived misstep. "Honestly, Ruth, can't you do anything right?" she would snap, her bony fingers gripping my arm with surprising strength. I would force a smile, my jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. "Of course, Edna, I'll do better next time." But there was no pleasing her, no respite from her constant criticism. Even Henry's rare visits did little to alleviate the tension, as he would simply nod along with his mother's complaints, his eyes averted from mine. It was during one of those interminable nights, as I sat by Edna's bedside, that something unexpected happened. Her usual acerbic demeanor had softened, her eyes taking on a faraway look. "You know, Ruth," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "you remind me of myself when I was younger." I stared at her, taken aback by the rare glimpse of vulnerability she was displaying. "I had dreams, too," she continued, her gaze fixed on some distant point. "But I let them slip away bit by bit until there was nothing left but bitterness and regret." A lump formed in my throat as I listened, her words striking a chord deep within me. "Don't make the same mistake I did, dear," she said, her frail hand reaching out to grasp mine. "Don't let my son break you." In that moment, I saw the woman she once was, the vibrant spirit that had been slowly crushed by the weight of her own choices. And in her eyes, I saw a glimmer of understanding, a recognition of the path I was treading. From that day on, something shifted between us. Edna's barbs lost their sting, and a tentative bond began to form. She would share stories of her youth, her dreams of becoming a painter, and I would listen with rapt attention, clinging to the hope that it wasn't too late for me. Edna's passing, when it finally came, was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. As I held her hand in those final moments, her eyes met mine, and I saw a silent plea, a plea for me to find the strength she had lost. In the aftermath of her death, I found myself adrift, untethered from the fragile connection that had kept me grounded. But Edna's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that I had a choice to make. I could continue down this path of subjugation, allowing Henry's dominance to strip away the last vestiges of my identity. Or I could heed Edna's warning and reclaim the life that had been denied to me for far too long. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. I was done being a prisoner in my own story. It was time to take the pen and write a new chapter, one where I was the author, the master of my own destiny. The months that followed Edna's passing were a blur of exhaustion and emotional turmoil. The bond we had forged in her final days had awakened something within me, a glimmer of hope that I could reclaim the life I had sacrificed for Henry's ambitions. But as the days trickled by, that hope began to wane, crushed beneath the weight of Henry's indifference and my own mounting despair. "Ruth, I don't understand why you're making such a fuss," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mother's affairs are settled, and we can finally move on with our lives." Move on? As if the past 6 months of grueling caregiving, of bearing the brunt of Edna's demands while he remained absent, meant nothing. "Henry, I need your support. I pleaded one evening, my voice trembling with exhaustion. I can't keep doing this alone. He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Don't be ridiculous. You've managed just fine without me. His words cut like a knife, reopening the wounds of neglect and belittlement that had festered for years. I clenched my fists, struggling to maintain my composure in the face of his callous disregard. I'm your wife, Henry, I said, my voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. Not your servant, not your mother's caretaker, your partner. He met my gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. And I'm your husband, Ruth. It's your duty to support me, no matter the sacrifices required. That was the breaking point. Years of suppressed anger and resentment came crashing down, a tidal of emotion that I could no longer contain. Duty? I spat, my hands balling into fists at my sides. Is that what you call this miserable existence? A life of servitude, stripped of my dreams, my passions, my very identity? Henry recoiled, taken aback by the fury in my voice. Ruth, you're being hysterical. Calm down and listen to reason. Reason? I laughed bitterly. What reason could possibly justify the way you've treated me, the way you've crushed my spirit beneath the weight of your ambition? His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But then his expression shifted, a flicker of something akin to fear passing across his features. You ungrateful wretch, he hissed. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? I met his gaze unflinchingly, my resolve hardening with each passing second. No, Henry. It's you who have taken everything from me piece by piece until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, silencing him. Enough. I'm done, Henry. Done with your lies, your manipulation, your utter disregard for my happiness. His eyes widened as I reached into the drawer of the end table, withdrawing the letter Edna had left me. The letter that had ignited the spark of rebellion within me. Your own mother saw the truth, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of sadness and determination. She knew the pain you inflicted upon me, and in her final act she urged me to find the strength to break free. Henry's face drained of color as I brandished the letter, the damning evidence of his mother's betrayal. Ruth, please, he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate pleading. We can work through this. I'll change, I promise. But his words rang hollow, a feeble attempt to cling to the control he had wielded for so long. I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. No, Henry, it's too late for promises. I'm leaving, and this time it's for good. As I turned and walked away, my heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years I felt alive, a fire burning within me that no amount of oppression could extinguish. I was free, and nothing, not Henry, not the ghosts of my past, would ever chain me again. The days following my declaration of independence were a whirlwind of activity. I had spent too long trapped in the gilded cage of Henry's making, and now that the door was open, I was determined to seize every opportunity for freedom. First on the agenda was securing my financial independence. For years, Henry had kept a tight grip on our finances, doling out meager allowances while indulging in extravagances without a second thought. But Edna's letter had included a surprising revelation, a sizable inheritance that she had left solely in my name. Use it wisely, my dear, her elegant script had urged. Build the life you deserve, free from the shackles of my son's control. With those funds, I was able to retain a fierce divorce attorney, a woman whose steely resolve matched my own. Together, we crafted an airtight case, documenting Henry's emotional abuse and financial manipulation with meticulous detail. Henry, of course, was livid when he discovered my intentions. You ungrateful shrew, he spat, his face contorted with rage. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? I met his gaze unflinchingly, my resolve unwavering. No, Henry. This is me reclaiming the life you stole from me, piece by piece. His eyes widened as I produced the divorce papers, the stark reality of my determination finally sinking in. You can't be serious, he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate pleading. Ruth, please, we can work through this. But his words fell on deaf ears. I had heard enough empty promises, enough lies disguised as concern. This time, I held all the power, and I intended to wield it without mercy. It's over, Henry, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Sign the papers, or I'll have no choice but to take this to court. His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of fear, a realization that his control over me had finally shattered. With trembling hands he reached for the pen and scrawled his signature across the dotted line, sealing his fate and my freedom in a single stroke. As I turned to leave, a sudden commotion behind me made me pause. Henry had collapsed, clutching his chest and gasping for air. "Ruth, you have to call an ambulance," he choked out, his eyes wide with panic. I should have felt pity, remorse, something akin to the concern a wife should have for her ailing husband. But as I looked down at him, all I felt was a profound sense of detachment, a realization that this man had forfeited any claim to my compassion long ago. "No, Henry," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. "I don't have to do anything for you anymore." His eyes widened in shock, but I had already turned away, the weight of his pleas sliding off me like water off a duck's back. As I strode out of the house, my head held high, I felt a surge of exhilaration coursing through my veins. This was it. The moment I had dreamed of for so long, the moment when I finally broke free from the shackles of Henry's control. In that instant, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength and resilience that had been forged in the fires of my oppression. Henry's reign was over, and a new chapter in my life was just beginning. I was free, and nothing, not Henry, not the ghosts of my past, would ever chain me again. The days following my confrontation with Henry were a blur of activity, fueled by a newfound sense of determination and purpose. I had spent far too long trapped in the gilded cage of his making, and now that the door was open, I was determined to seize every opportunity for freedom. My first order of business was to seek refuge with the one person I knew I could count on, my sister Joyce. She had been a constant source of support throughout the years, offering a sympathetic ear and a shoulder to lean on whenever Henry's cruelty became too much to bear. When I showed up on her doorstep, suitcase in hand, she took one look at my face and ushered me inside without a word. Joyce had always been perceptive, able to read the depths of my emotions with a single glance. "It's over, Joyce," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "I left him." Her eyes widened, and then she pulled me into a fierce embrace, her arms enveloping me with a warmth and acceptance that I had been denied for far too long. "Oh, Ruth," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so proud of you." In that moment, the floodgates opened, and years of pent-up pain and anguish came pouring out. I clung to Joyce, my body racked with sobs as I purged the toxicity that had been slowly poisoning my soul. Through it all, she held me, her strength and unwavering support a lifeline that kept me tethered to reality. In the days that followed, Joyce became my rock, my anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. She helped me navigate the legal intricacies of the divorce, ensuring that every step was taken to secure my independence and protect me from Henry's retaliation. And when the nightmares came, as they inevitably did, she was there, holding my hand and reminding me of the strength that had carried me this far. "You are a survivor, Ruth," she would say, her eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Never forget that." With Joyce's encouragement, I began to take tentative steps towards reclaiming the life that had been denied to me for so long. I sought out old friends, rekindling connections that had been severed by Henry's isolating grip. Their warm embraces and words of support were like balm to my wounded soul, reminding me that I was not alone in this journey. And slowly, bit by bit, the pieces of my shattered identity began to reform, like a delicate mosaic pieced together with care and determination. It was during this time that I received the news of Henry's hospitalization. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, a lingering remnant of the dutiful wife I had been conditioned to be. But that fleeting moment of weakness was quickly overshadowed by a sense of resolve, a realization that I owed this man nothing. "He made his choices, Ruth," Joyce said, her voice firm but laced with compassion, "and now he must face the consequences." Her words resonated deeply, a validation of the path I had chosen. Henry's downfall was not my burden to bear. It was the inevitable result of his own actions, a reckoning long overdue. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I felt a profound shift within me. The shackles of Henry's control had been broken, and in their place, a newfound sense of freedom and purpose took root. I was no longer defined by the confines of my marriage, no longer bound by the expectations and limitations imposed upon me. I was Ruth Parker, a woman reborn, with a future as vast and limitless as the horizon stretching before me. And as I stood on the precipice of this new chapter, I felt a surge of exhilaration and gratitude. The road ahead would undoubtedly be paved with challenges, but for the first time in decades, I was ready to face them head-on, armed with the strength and resilience that had been forged in the fires of my oppression. Henry's reign was over, and a new era, my era, had begun. The months that followed my departure from Henry's life were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. With Joyce's unwavering support, I navigated the legal intricacies of the divorce, ensuring that every step was taken to secure my independence and protect me from Henry's retaliation. It was during this time that I received an unexpected windfall, a sizable inheritance from Edna, left solely in my name. Her final act of defiance against her son's tyranny, a testament to the bond we had forged in her final days. "Use it wisely, my dear," her elegant script had urged. "Build the life you deserve, free from the shackles of my son's control." And so I did, channeling those funds into securing my own modest apartment, a cozy sanctuary where I could begin to rebuild the pieces of my shattered identity. But even as I reveled in my newfound freedom, the ghosts of my past lingered, whispering insidious doubts and fears. What if Henry refused to let me go? What if his thirst for control drove him to seek retribution? Those concerns were put to rest one fateful afternoon when a knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Henry standing before me, a mere shadow of his former self. "Ruth," he rasped, his voice tinged with desperation. "Please, we need to talk." I steeled myself, determined not to let his pleas sway me from the path I had chosen. "There's nothing left to say, Henry," I replied, my tone firm but laced with a hint of pity. "The divorce is final. It's time for you to move on." His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to reassert the control he had once held over me. But then his shoulders slumped and he nodded, a defeated man. "I never meant for it to go this far," he murmured, his gaze downcast. "I was a fool, Ruth, a fool who took the most precious thing in his life for granted." I said nothing, letting his words hang in the air between us, a bitter acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for everything." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing from my life as abruptly as he had entered it all those years ago. In the weeks and months that followed, I focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life, one small step at a time. With the financial security of Edna's inheritance, I was able to pursue my long-dormant passion for teaching, securing a part-time position at the local community college. The first time I stepped into that classroom, a rush of emotions washed over me. Excitement, trepidation, and above all, a profound sense of purpose. This was where I belonged, shaping young minds and igniting their love for literature, just as I had done so many years ago. As I stood before those eager faces, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the shackles of Henry's control finally falling away. I was no longer defined by the limitations he had imposed upon me. I was Ruth Parker, a woman reborn, with a future as vast and limitless as the horizon stretching before me. With each passing day, my confidence grew, nurtured by the support of my newfound community, colleagues who celebrated my passion, students who hung on my every word, and friends who had welcomed me back into their lives with open arms. And through it all, Joyce remained my steadfast ally, her unwavering belief in me a constant source of strength and inspiration. "Look at you, Ruth," she would say, her eyes shining with pride. "You've blossomed into the woman you were always meant to be." Her words resonated deeply, a validation of the long and arduous journey I had undertaken to reach this point. I had faced the depths of despair and emerged victorious, a phoenix rising from the ashes of my oppression. As the first anniversary of my newfound independence approached, I found myself reflecting on the woman I had been, the timid, broken creature who had allowed herself to be diminished by a man's cruelty. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the freedom I had claimed, but for the resilience that had carried me through the darkest of times. I was a survivor, a warrior who had stared down the demons of her past and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that I was the master of my own destiny. Henry's reign was over, and a new era, my era, had begun. The hushed whispers sliced through the silence like a knife, each word a twist of the blade in my heart. I froze, my grip tightening on the kitchen counter as the unmistakable voice of my husband Frank carried from the living room. "Laura, I've planned everything. Ellie's inheritance from her mother won't even touch our account. I'll ensure she has no say." A cold chill ran down my spine as the weight of his betrayal sank in. All these years, I had trusted him, loved him, despite the gradual shift in his behavior, the controlling nature, the belittling remarks. But this was a new low, even for Frank. Tears stung my eyes as memories flooded back. Our wedding day, the birth of our son, Thomas, the countless family gatherings filled with laughter and warmth. How had we fallen so far? When had the man I loved become this cruel, manipulative stranger? I steadied my trembling hands, taking a deep breath. No more. I would not let him strip me of my dignity, my independence. Not after everything I had sacrificed for this family. A plan began to form in my mind, fueled by a newfound determination. I would gather what little I had left and leave this toxic environment. For my own sake, and for the sake of my beloved grandchildren, Jake and Emma, the two bright lights in my life, deserving of a stable, loving home. As I stood there, the weight of Frank's betrayal pressing down on me, I made a silent vow. I would not be a victim. Not anymore. It was time to take back control, to reclaim the life that had been slowly chipped away by years of manipulation and emotional abuse. The path ahead would be difficult, but I knew in my heart that it was the only way. With each passing moment, my resolve grew stronger, a quiet fire burning within me, a fire that would guide me through the darkest of times and into a new dawn, where I could finally breathe freely once more. The weight of Frank's betrayal hung heavy in the air, suffocating me with each shallow breath. I knew I couldn't bear this burden alone, not anymore. Wiping away the tears that streamed down my cheeks, I reached for my phone with trembling hands and dialed the one person I could truly trust. "Sarah, it's me." I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can you come over? I need you." Within minutes, Sarah was at my doorstep, her warm embrace enveloping me as I broke down once more. We sat together on the couch, and through the sobs that racked my body, I poured out the truth, the ugly, painful truth about Frank's deceit and his plans to strip me of my inheritance. Sarah listened intently, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fury. When I had finished, she took my hands in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. "Ellie, you don't deserve this," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "You've given everything to this family, and he's repaid you with nothing but cruelty and manipulation." Her words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with the quiet voice that had been screaming for far too long. I nodded, my tears subsiding as a newfound determination took root. "You're right," I whispered. "I can't live like this anymore. I need to get out for my own sake and for the kids." Sarah's expression softened, and she squeezed my hands gently. "We'll figure this out together," she promised. "You're not alone in this." And so we began to plan, our voices hushed but our resolve unwavering. Sarah had been through her own battles with manipulative in-laws, and her experiences proved invaluable as we strategized my escape. We discussed every detail, from securing my finances to finding a safe haven where Frank couldn't reach me. With each passing moment, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of hope and purpose. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, I felt truly seen and supported. As the sun began to set, casting warm hues across the living room, Sarah pulled me into another embrace. "You're one of the strongest women I know, Ellie," she murmured, "and you're not alone anymore. We're in this together every step of the way." Tears of gratitude welled in my eyes as I clung to her, drawing strength from her unwavering support. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head-on, with the love and resilience that had carried me through so many storms before. With Sarah's unwavering support and the promise of a new beginning, I felt a renewed sense of determination coursing through my veins. It was time to take action, to gather what little I had left, and prepare for my escape from this toxic environment. Quietly, I began packing my belongings, carefully selecting the items that held the most meaning: old photographs, cherished mementos, and the few pieces of jewelry I had inherited from my mother. Each item was a reminder of the life I had once known, a life filled with love and laughter, before Frank's cruelty had tainted everything. As I worked, I could hear his voice echoing from the living room, berating me for the slightest perceived misstep. His words cut deep, but I refused to let them break me any longer. I had endured enough, and now, with Sarah's help, I was taking back control. In the quiet moments between Frank's outbursts, I found solace in the company of my beloved grandchildren, Jake and Emma. Their innocent smiles and infectious laughter were a balm to my weary soul, reminding me of the reasons I was fighting so fiercely. One evening, as I tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at me with those big, curious eyes. "Grandma, can we stay with you forever?" she asked, her voice laced with a childlike innocence that tugged at my heartstrings. I forced a smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I promise, sweetie. Grandma will always be here for you." Those words echoed in my mind, fueling my determination to create a safe, loving environment for these precious children, an environment free from the toxicity that had plagued our family for far too long. With each passing day, I grew more resolute, crystallizing my plans for our escape. I would take the grandchildren and flee to the cozy cabin my mother had left me, a sanctuary nestled deep in the heart of the mountains. There, we would be safe, free from Frank's manipulation and the suffocating grip of his mother, Laura. As I packed the last of our belongings, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, a woman I barely recognized, her eyes weary but burning with a newfound strength. This was not the end, I realized, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would reclaim the independence and dignity that had been stripped away from me for far too long. With a deep breath, I gathered the bags and ushered the children into the car, their faces alight with excitement at the prospect of adventure. As we pulled away from the house that had once been a home, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of hope and determination. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. A phoenix rising from the ashes of my former life, ready to spread my wings and soar towards a brighter future. Despite the newfound strength and determination that coursed through my veins, I couldn't have anticipated the events that would unfold at the next family gathering. It was a day that would forever change the course of my life, shattering any remaining illusions I had about the man I had once called my husband. The tension was palpable from the moment we arrived, with Frank's disdainful glances and Laura's snide remarks setting the tone for the afternoon. I tried my best to maintain a calm facade, focusing on the joy of being surrounded by my loved ones, but the weight of their contempt was suffocating. As the gathering progressed, Frank's behavior grew increasingly erratic, fueled by a potent mix of insecurity and alcohol. It was during a lull in the conversation that he turned his sights on me, his words cutting deeper than any knife. "Ellie, why don't you make yourself useful for once and get us all another round of drinks?" he sneered, his eyes narrowed in a way that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to Mom like that?" he shouted, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Frank's lips curled into a cruel smile as he turned to face our son. "She's useless, Thomas. She knows it. We all know it." Those words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me with their venom. I could feel the eyes of our family members upon me, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. But in that moment, something within me snapped. "I'll show you who's useless, Frank," I said, my voice steady and unwavering despite the storm of emotions raging within me. Frank's eyes widened, taken aback by my sudden defiance. "What did you just say to me?" I took a step forward, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "You heard me. I'm done being your punching bag, your emotional doormat. I'm done with all of it." The room fell silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Frank's face contorted with rage, his cheeks flushed a deep crimson. "You ungrateful little—" "That's enough!" Thomas interjected, positioning himself between us. "Dad, you've gone too far this time." In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The years of manipulation, the emotional abuse, the constant belittling, it all came crashing down around me, and I realized that the only path forward was one of freedom, of reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped away from me for far too long. As Frank continued to spew his vitriol, I turned and walked away, my head held high. Sarah's reassuring hand found mine, and together we gathered the grandchildren and made our way to the car, leaving the toxic environment behind us. The drive home was silent, save for the occasional sniffle from Emma, who had witnessed the entire ordeal. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw not fear or sadness in her eyes, but a quiet strength, a resilience that mirrored my own. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family, united by love and a shared determination to break free from the shackles of oppression. The road would be long and arduous, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a promise of a brighter future, where I could finally breathe freely once more. The weight of Frank's cruelty hung heavy in the air as we drove away from that fateful family gathering, but with each mile that stretched between us and that toxic environment, I felt a sense of lightness wash over me. Sarah's reassuring presence beside me, her hand gently squeezing mine, reminded me that I was not alone in this fight. As we pulled up to the cozy cabin nestled deep in the heart of the mountains, a wave of relief washed over me. This was it, my sanctuary, my chance at a new beginning. The very place my mother had left me, a haven untainted by the darkness that had consumed my life for far too long. Thomas was already there, having arrived ahead of us to prepare for our arrival. As we stepped out of the car, his warm embrace enveloped me, and in that moment, I knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family, united by love and resilience. "Mom, you're safe here now," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We're not going to let him hurt you anymore." I nodded, blinking back tears as I clung to him, drawing strength from his unwavering support. Sarah ushered the grandchildren inside, their excited chatter filling the crisp mountain air, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. A promise of a brighter future where I could finally breathe freely once more. Over the next few days we settled into our new surroundings, each of us finding solace in the simple pleasures of our secluded retreat. The grandchildren explored the nearby trails, their laughter echoing through the trees like a soothing balm to my weary soul. Sarah tended to the small garden, her hands coaxing new life from the rich soil, while Thomas and I worked together to make the cabin feel like a true home. And through it all, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders with each passing moment, replaced by a sense of freedom and independence that I had long since forgotten. No longer did I have to walk on eggshells, fearing Frank's wrath or Laura's cutting remarks. Here, in this sanctuary, I was free to be myself, to rediscover the woman I had once been, before the years of manipulation and emotional abuse had chipped away at my spirit. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself embracing this newfound independence with open arms. I blocked Frank's number, severing the last remaining tie to that toxic environment, and focused instead on the love and support that surrounded me. Thomas and Sarah became my rock, their unwavering presence a constant reminder that I was not alone in this journey. And then one evening, as we gathered around the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm glow over our little family, I looked around at the faces of those I loved most in this world, and a profound sense of peace washed over me. "We did it," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the gentle crackle of the fire. Sarah's arm slipped around my shoulders, pulling me close. "Yes, Ellie," she murmured. "You did it? You're free." In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head-on, armed with the strength and resilience that had carried me through the darkest of storms. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive. A phoenix rising from the ashes of my former life, ready to spread my wings and soar towards a future filled with love, laughter, and the promise of endless possibilities. The first few weeks in our mountain sanctuary passed in a blissful haze, each day filled with the simple joys of freedom and the love of my family. But even as I basked in the warmth of our newfound peace, a part of me knew that the storm was far from over. It was a crisp autumn morning when the illusion of safety was shattered. I had just finished tending to the small garden, my hands still caked with rich soil, when the unmistakable sound of a car engine echoed through the trees. My heart skipped a beat as a familiar figure emerged from the vehicle, his face twisted into a mask of rage. "You think you can hide from me?" Frank roared, his voice cutting through the tranquil silence like a knife. I steeled myself, drawing upon the newfound strength that had carried me this far. "I'm not hiding, Frank," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremors that threatened to betray me. "I'm free, and you can't control me anymore." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the man I had once loved, the charming, confident figure who had swept me off my feet all those years ago. But that illusion was quickly shattered as he took a menacing step forward. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he spat, his words laced with venom. "Running off with my grandchildren, turning my own son against me. Well, let me tell you something, Ellie. This little game of yours ends now." I stood my ground, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "This isn't a game, Frank. This is my life, and I'm taking it back. You've had your chance, and you blew it." His face contorted with rage, and for a moment I feared he might lash out physically. But before he could make another move, Thomas and Sarah emerged from the cabin, their presence a solid wall of support at my back. "Dad, you need to leave," Thomas said, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. "You're not welcome here anymore." Frank's gaze shifted to his son, and I saw a flicker of something akin to desperation in his eyes. "Thomas, please," he pleaded, his tone suddenly softer, more calculated. "You know how your mother can be. She's just overreacting as usual. Come home and we can sort this out like a family." For a moment I saw Thomas waver, his loyalty to his father warring with the reality of the situation. But then Sarah's hand found his, and he seemed to draw strength from her touch. "No, Dad," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't about overreacting. This is about Mom finally standing up for herself, and I'm not going to let you take that away from her." Frank's eyes narrowed, and I could see the last vestiges of his control slipping away. "You ungrateful little—" "That's enough," I interrupted, my voice ringing out with a clarity and conviction I hadn't felt in years. "Frank, it's over. You've lost. It's time for you to leave." He opened his mouth as if to protest, but one look at the united front before him seemed to drain the fight from his body. With a final, withering glare in my direction, he turned and stalked back to his car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the sound of his engine faded into the distance, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Sarah's arms enveloped me, and I clung to her, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "You did it, Ellie," she whispered. "You stood your ground, and he couldn't break you." Tears of relief stung my eyes as I nodded, my gaze shifting to Thomas, who wore a proud smile on his face. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As a family united by love and resilience, a force stronger than any manipulation or cruelty that Frank could throw our way. The road to healing would be long, but for the first time in years, I felt truly free. A phoenix rising from the ashes of my former life, ready to spread my wings and soar towards a future filled with endless possibilities. Despite the confrontation with Frank and his hasty retreat, a lingering sense of unease hung in the air like a thick fog. I knew him too well. His pride and desperation would not allow him to simply slink away in defeat. And sure enough, just a few days later, my fears were realized. It was late afternoon when the familiar rumble of an engine echoed through the trees, shattering the tranquil silence of our mountain sanctuary. Sarah and I exchanged a worried glance as Thomas stepped outside, his brow furrowed with concern. "Dad?" he called out, his voice tinged with a mixture of wariness and hope. "Is that you?" The car door opened, and Frank emerged, his expression a carefully crafted mask of calm, a stark contrast to the rage that had consumed him during our last encounter. "Thomas," he said, his tone almost jovial, "I'm glad you're here. I was hoping we could talk, just the two of us." Thomas hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the cabin where Sarah and I stood watching, our bodies tense with apprehension. "I don't know, Dad," he began, but Frank was already closing the distance between them, his hand clapping down on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that was equal parts affectionate and controlling. "Come on, son," he cajoled. You know how your mother can be, always overreacting, making mountains out of molehills. I just want to clear the air, make things right again." I could see the conflict playing out on Thomas's face, the loyalty he felt towards his father warring with the knowledge of the pain and manipulation he had witnessed. But before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a protective fire. "Don't listen to him, Thomas," she said, her voice firm. "He's just trying to manipulate you, like he's always done." Frank's gaze shifted to Sarah, his lips curling into a sneer. "Stay out of this, girl," he growled. "This is between me and my son." "No, Dad," Thomas interjected, his spine straightening as he drew strength from Sarah's presence. "She's right. You've always tried to control us, to make us dance to your tune, but not anymore." Frank's mask of calm slipped, his face contorting with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "That's enough," I said, stepping forward to stand beside Thomas and Sarah, our united front a solid wall against Frank's crumbling power. "Frank, it's time for you to leave. You've lost control, and no amount of manipulation or empty promises is going to change that." For a moment, he seemed poised to lash out, his fists clenching at his sides. But then, as if sensing the futility of his efforts, the fight seemed to drain from his body. His shoulders slumped, and he fixed me with a look that was equal parts hatred and desperation. "I bet you're just miserable without me," he spat, his words laced with venom. "Just come home, Ellie. We can make this right, like it used to be." I met his gaze unflinchingly, drawing strength from the love and support that surrounded me. "I'd rather be miserable and free than controlled and miserable," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. Frank's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Thomas stepped forward, his arm wrapping protectively around my shoulders. "Dad, leave," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not welcome here anymore, not after everything you've done." For a long moment, Frank simply stood there, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. But in the end, he seemed to recognize the futility of his efforts, and with a final, withering glare in our direction, he turned and stalked back to his car, his footsteps heavy with the weight of defeat. As the sound of his engine faded into the distance, I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. Sarah's arms enveloped me, and I clung to her, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "You did it, Ellie," she whispered. "You stood your ground, and he couldn't break you." I nodded, my gaze shifting to Thomas, who wore a proud smile on his face. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family united by love and resilience, a force stronger than any manipulation or cruelty that Frank could throw our way. The road to healing would be long, but for the first time in years, I felt truly free, a phoenix rising from the ashes of my former life, ready to spread my wings and soar towards a future filled with endless possibilities. With Frank's departure, a weight seemed to lift from our little sanctuary, replaced by a sense of peace and possibility that had been sorely lacking for far too long. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, as we settled into our new lives, free from the toxic influence that had plagued us for so many years. Thomas and Sarah were a constant source of support, their unwavering presence a reminder that I was no longer alone in this journey. Together, we worked to create a warm, loving environment for the grandchildren, filling our days with laughter and simple pleasures that had been all too rare in our former lives. Jake and Emma, bless their innocent souls, seemed to thrive in our newfound freedom. Their smiles grew brighter with each passing day, their laughter echoing through the trees like a soothing balm to my weary heart. It was in those moments, watching them play and explore the wonders of our mountain retreat, that I found myself truly letting go of the pain and resentment that had weighed me down for so long. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rediscover the woman I had once been, the strong, independent spirit that had been slowly chipped away by years of manipulation and emotional abuse. With Sarah's encouragement, I even took a part-time job at the local community center, finding joy in the simple act of helping others and forging new connections. It was during one of my shifts at the center that I ran into an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years due to the isolating nature of my former life. Her eyes widened in surprise as she recognized me, and for a moment I braced myself for the pity or judgment that had become all too familiar. But instead, she pulled me into a warm embrace, her eyes shining with genuine happiness. "Ellie, it's so good to see you," she murmured. "You look radiant." I couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment that had been sorely lacking for far too long. "Thank you," I replied, squeezing her hand. "It's been quite a journey, but I'm finally free." Over the following weeks and months, I made a conscious effort to repair the bridges that had been burned during my years of isolation. One by one, I reconnected with old friends and family members, opening myself up to the love and support that had been there all along, just waiting for me to break free from the chains that had bound me. And through it all, my grandchildren remained the shining beacons of hope and resilience that had guided me through the darkest of times. As I watched them grow and thrive in our newfound sanctuary, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude for the strength and courage that had carried me to this point. One evening, as we gathered around the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm glow over our little family, Emma snuggled close to me, her eyes shining with contentment. "I love you, Grandma," she murmured, her voice thick with the innocence of childhood. I pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I love you too, sweetie," I replied, my heart swelling with a love and joy that I had once feared I would never feel again. In that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family, united by love and resilience. The road to healing had been long and arduous, but as I looked around at the faces of those I loved most in this world, I knew that we had emerged from the darkness stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. This was not the end of our journey, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter filled with endless possibilities and the promise of a future where love, laughter, and the unbreakable bonds of family would reign supreme. And as I basked in the warmth of that newfound freedom, I couldn't help but feel like a phoenix rising from the ashes, ready to spread my wings and soar towards a brighter tomorrow. "Where do you think you're going?" I asked Harold, my husband of 20 years, as he packed his bag without meeting my eyes. "I need some space, Eliza. I'll be staying with my mother for a while," he replied coldly, zipping up the suitcase with finality. My heart sank as the words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. The man I had shared a life with, the one I thought I knew better than anyone, was suddenly a stranger. With those few words, my entire world shifted on its axis, leaving me grasping for purchase in a reality that no longer made sense. Harold turned and walked out the door without another word, leaving me standing in the middle of our bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life I had taken for granted. The ticking of the clock on the nightstand seemed deafening in the silence he left behind. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. How could he just leave like that, without any explanation or warning? What had I missed? What signs had I been too blind to see? A knock at the front door jolted me from my daze, and I hurried to answer it, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. It was my oldest friend, Frances, her face etched with concern. "Eliza, what's going on? I saw Harold leaving with his suitcase," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat, tears welling in my eyes. Frances wrapped her arms around me, and I crumbled against her, sobs racking my body. "Shh, it's all right," she murmured, stroking my hair. "Tell me what happened." I pulled back, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "He left, Frances. Harold just packed a bag and left, said he needed space and was going to stay with his mother." Frances's brow furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That doesn't sound like him at all. Did he give you any reason?" I shook my head, feeling helpless and lost. "No, nothing. One minute everything was fine, and the next he was just gone." Frances took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Listen to me, Eliza. You can't let this break you. You're stronger than that, and you'll get through this, whatever it is." Her words were like a lifeline, anchoring me in the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "You're right. I can't just sit here and wallow. I need to figure out what's going on, why he would do this." Frances gave me a resolute nod. "That's my girl. Now, why don't you go freshen up and we'll take a walk around the neighborhood? Some fresh air might help clear your head." I squeezed her hand gratefully, already feeling a little steadier. As I made my way to the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. A woman of 61, with lines etched around her eyes and mouth, a lifetime of experiences written on her face. But there was a spark in those eyes, a determination that had been dormant for too long. My name is Eliza Parker, and this was the moment my life truly began. After Harold's abrupt departure, I found myself grasping for any semblance of normalcy in the life I had known. Frances insisted I call my children, Molly and Jacob, to let them know what had happened. They need to hear it from you, Eliza, she said firmly, handing me the phone. No matter how strained things might be, they're still your family. With trembling fingers, I dialed Molly's number first. She lived out in California with her husband and 2 young kids, her life a whirlwind of career and parenting that often left little room for her aging parents back in Missouri. Mom, is everything okay? Molly's voice was tinged with concern when she answered. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Molly, it's your father. He's left. Packed a bag and walked out. Said he needed space. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in Molly's mind as she processed the news. What? But why? That doesn't sound like Dad at all. I don't know, honey. He didn't give me any real explanation, I replied, my voice wavering. He just said he was going to stay with his mother for a while. Molly let out a frustrated sigh. Typical. He never could communicate, could he? Are you okay, Mom? Do you need me to come home? I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. No, I'll be all right. Frances is here with me. I thought you should know. After a few more reassurances, I hung up, feeling both comforted and drained by the conversation. Next, I steeled myself to call Jacob, my son, who lived in Denver with his long-term girlfriend. The conversation with Jacob was much the same, a mixture of shock, concern, and that underlying current of tension that had always existed between us. He promised to check in regularly, but I could sense his hesitation, the unspoken words hanging in the air. As I set the phone down, Frances gave me a sympathetic look. That couldn't have been easy. I shook my head warily. No, but it's a start, I suppose. At least they know what's going on. Frances nodded, her expression thoughtful. You know, Eliza, this might be a chance for you to really reconnect with them, to mend some of those frayed bonds. I sighed, running a hand through my graying hair. I don't know, Frances. There's so much history there, so many missed opportunities and misunderstandings. All the more reason to try, she insisted. You can't change the past, but you can shape the future. And who knows, maybe this whole mess with Harold will be the wake-up call you all needed. Her words struck a chord within me, and I nodded slowly. You're right. I can't just sit back and let this tear my family apart any further. With renewed determination, I began sorting through the clutter in the study, searching for any clues that might shed light on Harold's sudden departure. That's when I stumbled upon an old, yellowed envelope tucked away in a drawer. A letter from Harold's mother, Rose, postmarked years ago. My hands trembled as I opened it, my eyes scanning the spidery handwriting. Rose had always been a stern, uncompromising woman, and her words were laced with thinly veiled criticism and disapproval of our marriage. As I read on, a sense of unease crept over me. Rose had clearly harbored resentments and doubts about our relationship, doubts that Harold had seemingly shared with her. Had those seeds of discontent taken root over the years, festering until they finally drove him away? I clutched the letter tightly, a new resolve taking hold. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to understand what had truly led to this fracture in my life, I would have to confront the source, Rose herself. Frances noticed the determined set of my jaw and raised an eyebrow. What is it, Eliza? What did you find? I met her gaze, my voice steady. A letter from Rose, and I think it's time I paid her a visit. The drive to Rose's house was tense and silent, the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. Frances insisted on coming with me, her presence a steadying force in the storm of emotions swirling within. As we pulled up to the modest bungalow, I steeled myself for the confrontation ahead. Rose had always been a formidable woman, her sharp tongue and uncompromising nature a source of friction in our family. But now, with Harold's sudden departure and the revelations in her letter, I knew she held the key to unraveling the mysteries that had upended my life. The door swung open before I could knock, and there she stood, Rose Parker, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes narrowing as she took us in. "Eliza," she said, her voice clipped. "I should have known you'd come sniffing around eventually." I squared my shoulders, refusing to be cowed. "Rose, we need to talk. About Harold, about what's going on." She pursed her lips, considering me for a moment before stepping aside to let us in. "Very well. But I warn you, you may not like what you hear." As we settled in her living room, the tension was palpable. Rose wasted no time in cutting to the heart of the matter. "Harold's been unhappy for years, Eliza, trapped in a marriage that slowly suffocated him, crushed by expectations he could never live up to." Her words hit me like a physical blow, and I struggled to maintain my composure. "What are you talking about? Harold never said anything to me." Rose let out a derisive snort. "Of course he didn't. That's just the kind of man he is, bottling everything up until it festers and poisons him from the inside out." Frances placed a steadying hand on my arm as Rose continued, her words like knives slicing through the illusions I had clung to for so long. "He's been in contact with an old flame, you know, June Mitchell. She's been a sympathetic ear, someone who understands his struggles in a way you never could." The name hung in the air, a weight pressing down on my chest. June Mitchell, a ghost from Harold's past, now resurrected to haunt our present. That's not possible," I stammered, even as doubt crept in, whispering insidious truths I had been too blind to see. Rose fixed me with a piercing stare. "Isn't it, though? Think about it, Eliza. All the signs were there, if you'd only opened your eyes." As her words sank in, a wave of hurt and anger washed over me. How could Harold have betrayed me like this? How could he have allowed this other woman to worm her way into our lives, to poison the well of our marriage? But beneath the fury, a newfound resolve took root. I would not be a passive victim in this tragedy. If Harold had chosen to abandon our life together, to seek solace in the arms of another, then I would confront him. I would demand answers, and I would make him face the consequences of his actions. I rose to my feet, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Thank you for your honesty, Rose. It's more than I ever got from your son." She inclined her head, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Don't thank me yet, Eliza. The truth is a double-edged sword, and you may find yourself cut deeper than you ever imagined." As Frances and I made our way back to the car, I could feel the weight of Rose's words settling over me. But I refused to be cowed, refused to let this break me. Harold had made his choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I would not go gently into that good night. I would fight for the truth, for the life I deserved, even if it meant burning everything to the ground and rising from the ashes. Armed with the truth about Harold's affair, I knew I had to confront him directly. Frances tried to dissuade me, worried about the emotional toll it would take, but I was resolute. Too many years had been wasted in the shadows of half-truths and unspoken resentments. It was time to drag everything into the light, no matter how painful. Rose begrudgingly provided me with Harold's whereabouts, a seedy motel on the outskirts of town, where he had been staying since leaving our home. The drive there felt like a march towards an inevitable reckoning, each mile bringing me closer to the moment when I would finally face the man who had so thoroughly betrayed me. When I arrived, Harold was sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes widening in surprise and something else. Shame, perhaps. "Eliza," he began, rising to his feet. "What are you doing here?" I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't bother with the pleasantries, Harold. I know about June. I know you've been carrying on an affair with her behind my back." His shoulders slumped, and he averted his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "How did you find out?" "Does it matter?" I snapped. "What matters is that you lied to me, betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way. How could you do this to me, Harold, to our marriage?" He shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. June, she understood me in a way you never could. She made me feel alive again, like I wasn't just going through the motions." His words cut deep, but I refused to let him see how much they stung. "So that's your excuse? You threw away decades of marriage because some other woman made you feel good about yourself?" Harold sighed. running a hand through his thinning hair. It's more complicated than that, Eliza. Our marriage has been dying a slow death for years, and you know it. We've been drifting apart, living separate lives under the same roof. June was just an escape. I clenched my fists, fury rising within me like a tidal wave. An escape? Is that all I was to you, Harold? A prison to be escaped from? He opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. You know, I found June's letters to you. All those poisonous words, planting seeds of doubt and resentment, encouraging you to leave me. She manipulated you, Harold, played on your weaknesses like a virtuoso. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the facade of indifference he had been projecting. What are you talking about? June would never. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course she would. She's been jealous of me for years, ever since we were young. This was her twisted way of finally winning, of taking you away from me. Harold shook his head slowly, realization dawning on his features. I had no idea. She made it seem like she was just trying to help me find happiness. Well, now you know the truth, I said, my voice hard as steel. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep running, keep letting her manipulate you? Or are you finally going to take responsibility for your actions? He met my gaze then, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of the man I had once loved, the man who had promised to cherish and honor me until death did us part. I don't know, he said softly. I've made such a mess of things, Eliza. I don't know if I can ever make it right. I held his gaze, my jaw set with determination. That's up to you, Harold. But I'll tell you this. I'm done being a victim in this story. If you want to keep wallowing in self-pity and letting June pull your strings, be my guest. But I'm taking my life back, with or without you. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving him to ponder the wreckage of our life together. As I stepped back into the harsh light of day, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but one thing was certain. I would not be defined by Harold's betrayal or June's twisted machinations. I was Eliza Parker, and I was just getting started. After my confrontation with Harold, a fire was lit within me. I was done being a passive observer in my own life, allowing others to dictate my path. With France's unwavering support, I began to piece together the full extent of June's manipulations, poring over the letters and emails she had sent to Harold over the years. The more I uncovered, the sicker I felt. June had been slowly poisoning Harold's mind, planting seeds of doubt and resentment, preying on his insecurities and fears of failure. Her words were like a carefully crafted web, ensnaring him deeper with each passing year until he could no longer see the truth. That vindictive snake, Frances spat as we read through the latest batch of letters. She's been playing the long game, waiting for her chance to strike. I nodded grimly, feeling a mixture of anger and pity for Harold. As much as his actions had devastated me, it was clear that he had been a victim too, manipulated by a woman consumed by jealousy and a twisted desire for revenge. We need to stop her, I said, my voice steely with determination. She can't be allowed to keep ruining lives like this. Frances gave me a praising look. You're sure about this, Eliza? Going after June won't be easy, and it could get messy. I met her gaze unflinching. I'm sure. For too long, I've let others dictate the course of my life. It's time I took control and fought for what's right. A slow smile spread across Frances's face. That's my girl. All right, let's hatch a plan. Over the next few weeks, we carefully laid the groundwork, gathering evidence and formulating our strategy. I knew that simply confronting June wouldn't be enough. She was too skilled at manipulation, too adept at twisting the truth to suit her needs. No, we needed to expose her lies in a way that left no room for doubt, no avenue for her to slither out of accountability. As we dug deeper, a clearer picture emerged of June's motivations. It wasn't just about winning Harold. It was about winning, period. She had harbored a deep-seated envy and resentment towards me ever since we were young, always feeling like she lived in my shadow. Harold had been her twisted way of finally claiming victory, of proving her superiority. But even as I uncovered the depths of her depravity, I felt something else stirring within me, a newfound sense of self-worth and independence. June's actions, as despicable as they were, had inadvertently given me the push I needed to break free from the shackles of my unfulfilling marriage and rediscover my own strength. With Frances's guidance, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I volunteered at the local community center, reconnected with old friends, and even took up painting, a hobby I had abandoned years ago in the pursuit of being the perfect wife and mother. With each small step, I felt myself growing stronger, more resilient. The weight of Harold's betrayal, once a crushing burden, began to lighten as I realized that my worth was not defined by his actions or June's twisted games. And as I looked ahead, I knew that the road to true freedom would not be an easy one. June would not go quietly into the night, and Harold's role in all of this remained unresolved. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim the life that had been slowly slipping away from me. I was Eliza Parker, and I was just getting started. With France's unwavering support, I knew the time had come to confront June directly. We had gathered enough evidence of her manipulations, her twisted machinations that had torn my family apart. It was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. The journey to Florida, where June had been living since her split from her own husband, felt like a march towards an inevitable reckoning. Each mile brought me closer to the woman who had so thoroughly upended my life, all in pursuit of some misguided sense of victory over me. When I finally stood on her doorstep, a wave of emotions washed over me. Anger, hurt, a burning desire for justice. I steeled myself and knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. June opened the door, and for a moment, her eyes widened in surprise before a sickly sweet smile spread across her face. "Why, Eliza Parker? What a lovely surprise." I held up a hand, cutting off her false pleasantries. "Cut the act, June. We both know why I'm here." Her smile faltered, and she regarded me with a cool gaze. "Do we now? And what, pray tell, do you think you know?" Without a word, I thrust the stack of letters and emails into her hands, watching as her expression shifted from feigned innocence to something darker, more calculating. "I know about your lies, June. I know how you've been manipulating Harold for years, planting seeds of doubt and resentment, encouraging him to leave me." My voice was steady, fueled by a righteous anger that burned within me. June's lips curled into a sneer as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the damning evidence. So what? Harold was a lost cause, a man trapped in a loveless marriage. I merely showed him the way out. "You did more than that, and you know it," I shot back. "This wasn't about helping Harold. It was about your own twisted need to win, to finally best me after all these years." A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, passed over June's features, and for a moment, the mask slipped, revealing the bitter, envious woman beneath. "You always had everything, didn't you, Eliza?" She spat, her voice dripping with venom. "The perfect husband, the perfect life, while I was left with the scraps. Well, not anymore. I took what was yours, and there's nothing you can do about it." Her words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to back down. "You're wrong, June. You may have taken Harold, but you'll never take my self-worth, my dignity. Those are mine, and no amount of your scheming can change that." June's eyes narrowed, and she took a step towards me, her finger jabbing into my chest. "We'll see about that, Eliza. We'll see who's left standing when the dust settles." But as she spoke, I felt something shift within me, a weight lifting, a burden finally cast aside. June's threats, her posturing, it all rang hollow. She was a bitter, twisted woman clinging to the past, while I had already begun to forge a new path forward. I met her gaze, unflinching. "You know what, June? You're right. We will see who's left standing, but I have a feeling it won't be the woman who spent her life mired in jealousy and resentment." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving June sputtering in my wake. As I stepped out into the Florida sunshine, I felt a sense of catharsis wash over me. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. A chance to finally face the root of my pain and emerge stronger on the other side. I was no longer defined by Harold's choices or June's schemes. I was Eliza Parker, a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and reborn into something stronger, something unbreakable. And as I looked towards the horizon, I knew that the best was yet to come. After my cathartic confrontation with June, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. The twisted web of lies and manipulation she had spun had finally been exposed, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to revel in that sense of victory, of having reclaimed my power and self-worth. But deep down, I knew that the true battle was far from over. Harold's role in this saga remained unresolved, a lingering specter that threatened to undermine the progress I had made. I knew eventually I would have to face him again, to confront the man who had so thoroughly betrayed me and decide once and for all whether our marriage was worth salvaging. That moment came sooner than I expected. I had returned home from Florida, my mind still processing the events of the past few weeks, when the doorbell rang. Francis, ever my steadfast companion, answered the door, only to usher in a haggard-looking Harold. "Eliza," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we need to talk." I regarded him coolly, my newfound strength and independence acting as a bulwark against the flood of memories and emotions his presence stirred within me. "Talk?" I echoed. "About what, Harold? About how you threw away our marriage for a twisted fantasy spun by a bitter, jealous woman?" He flinched at my words, but didn't back down. "I know, Eliza. I know what June did, how she manipulated me, played on my insecurities and fears. But that's no excuse for my actions." I arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I was weak," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. "I let myself be led astray, blinded by my own sense of failure and inadequacy. But seeing you stand up to June, seeing the strength and resilience you've shown, it opened my eyes." He took a step towards me, his eyes pleading. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Eliza. I know I've hurt you in ways that can never be undone, but I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly and deeply sorry for the pain I've caused you." His words hung in the air, heavy with remorse and regret. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the love I had once held for this man, the man who had promised to cherish and honor me until death did us part. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by the memory of his betrayal, of the months of anguish and heartbreak I had endured. I shook my head slowly. "I appreciate your apology, Harold, but words can only go so far. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." His face fell, but he nodded, seeming to accept my response. "I understand," he said quietly. "Just know that I'll be here waiting for as long as it takes. You've shown me what true strength and resilience look like, Eliza, and if there's even a chance to earn back your trust, your love, I'll take it." With that, he turned and left, leaving me to ponder his words and the implications they carried. Francis placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Are you all right, dear?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I will be, Francis. I will be." In that moment, I knew that Harold's plea for forgiveness, as heartfelt as it may have been, was not something I could grant, at least not yet. The wounds were still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. But I also knew that I had emerged from this ordeal stronger, more resilient, and more certain of my own worth than ever before. Whatever the future held, I would face it on my own terms, guided by the strength and independence I had fought so hard to reclaim. Harold's redemption, if it was to come, would be a long and arduous journey. But I was ready to walk that path, secure in the knowledge that I held the power to shape my own destiny. In the aftermath of Harold's plea for forgiveness, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me yearned to grant him the absolution he sought, to find a way to rebuild what had been so thoroughly shattered. But a larger part, the part that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and heartbreak, knew that such a path would only lead to more pain. It was Francis who helped me see the way forward. "Eliza, dear," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you've come so far, fought so hard to reclaim your independence and sense of self. Don't let Harold's remorse sway you from that path." Her words resonated deeply within me. She was right. I had clawed my way back from the brink, emerging stronger and more resilient than ever before. To simply forgive Harold, to slip back into the patterns of our old life, would be to undo all that hard-won progress. And so, with a heavy heart, I made the decision to keep moving forward, to continue forging my own path without the weight of Harold's baggage holding me back. It was a choice that brought both pain and liberation. The pain came from the lingering tendrils of love and attachment that still bound me to the man I had once sworn to cherish until death did us part. But the liberation, that was a heady draught, a taste of the freedom I had so desperately craved. With Frances's steadfast support, I turned my focus inward, mending the frayed bonds with my children, Molly and Jacob. Years of neglect and misunderstanding had driven wedges between us, but now, in the wake of my own personal rebirth, I was determined to bridge those divides. It wasn't easy. Old wounds ran deep, and there were times when the hurt and resentment threatened to overwhelm us all. But slowly, steadily, we chipped away at the walls that had separated us, rediscovering the love and connection that had been buried beneath the rubble of our fractured family. And through it all, Frances was there, a steadying presence, a reminder of the importance of living authentically and without regret. Her own life, marked by loss and missed opportunities, had instilled in her a wisdom that she freely imparted to me. "Life is too short, Eliza," she would say, her eyes shining with a bittersweet melancholy. "Too short to waste on bitterness and resentment. Cherish the moments you have, and never let fear hold you back from living fully." Her words proved prophetic, for not long after, Frances passed away, leaving a void in my life that could never truly be filled. But even in her absence, her legacy lived on, a guiding light that illuminated my path forward. It was in the wake of her passing that I made the decision to truly embrace the freedom I had fought so hard to attain. I packed a bag and set out on a solo journey, a pilgrimage of sorts, to a small coastal town where the rhythms of the ocean promised to soothe my weary soul. There, amidst the crashing waves and salty air, I found a peace that had long eluded me. I spent my days walking along the beach, journaling and simply existing in the present moment, unburdened by the ghosts of my past. It was during those quiet moments that I began to truly understand the depth of my own strength, the resilience that had carried me through the darkest of times. And as I looked towards the horizon, I knew that my journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I welcomed the unknown with open arms, ready to embrace whatever life had in store. For I was Eliza Parker, a woman reborn, and the best was yet to come. I clutched the arms of my wheelchair, my eyes wide with disbelief, as Trevor's words cut through me like a knife. "You can't even keep the house tidy anymore. You're worthless to me now." "Trevor, what are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stood there, his expression cold and detached. "I've been thinking for a while now, and it's clear. You can't stay here anymore." My heart sank as I saw the scornful expressions of his mother, Lorraine, and stepdaughter, Erica, glaring down at me. This was the family I had tried so hard to be a part of, the people I had sacrificed so much for, and yet they looked at me like I was nothing more than a burden. It all started a few years ago when I met Trevor at a local community event. He was charming, successful, and seemed like the perfect partner. Little did I know that marrying him meant inheriting a whole lot of baggage in the form of his overbearing mother and his resentful teenage daughter from his first marriage. From the moment I stepped into their lives, Erica made it clear that she didn't want me there. She would leave her dirty clothes strewn around the house, expecting me to pick after her, and then have the audacity to scream at me if I didn't do her laundry to her liking. Lorraine was even worse. She would constantly remind me of how perfect Trevor's first wife was, making snide comments about my cooking or my inability to keep the house as pristine as she would have liked. Despite their constant undermining, I tried my best to create a harmonious family. I would plan outings, cook their favorite meals, and even take on extra freelance editing work to contribute financially. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Trevor, bless his soul, was oblivious to it all. He would simply brush off my concerns, telling me that I just needed to try harder to fit in. Little did he know that the harder I tried, the more I felt like an outsider in my own home. As I sat there, staring at the three of them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. After everything I had done for this family, they were casting me aside like a piece of unwanted garbage. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized that I had been living a lie, trying to please people who would never truly accept me. It was time for me to take back control of my life and find the strength within myself that they had tried so hard to break. With a newfound determination, I looked Trevor straight in the eye and said, "Fine. If that's how you really feel, then I'll go. But mark my words, you haven't seen the last of me." Those first few months after marrying Trevor were a whirlwind of emotions. I was so caught up in the excitement of starting a new chapter in my life that I failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. It all started with Erica's hostile behavior towards me. I remember the day she stormed into the laundry room, angrily throwing her school uniform at me. "These needed to be washed and pressed by tomorrow morning," she demanded, her eyes narrowed with contempt. "Erica, I have a lot of work to catch up on tonight," I tried to reason with her. "Can't you put them in the hamper, and I'll get to them in the morning?" "No," she snapped. "I need them done now. That's your job, isn't it?" Before I could respond, Lorraine appeared in the doorway, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Natalie, dear, you really should be more on top of things like this. My Trevor's first wife always had the laundry done promptly." I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment as Lorraine launched into yet another story about how perfect Trevor's ex-wife was. It was a constant refrain, a not-so-subtle reminder that I would never measure up in her eyes. When I tried to talk to Trevor about it, he simply brushed it off. "They're just adjusting to the new family dynamic," he said dismissively. "You need to try harder to fit in." Try harder? I was already working myself to the bone, juggling my freelance editing work with keeping the household running smoothly. But no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough for Erica and Lorraine. Their constant criticism and belittling remarks wore me down over time. I started to doubt myself, questioning whether I truly belonged in this family. Was I just fooling myself into thinking I could make this work? The breaking point came during a neighborhood gathering. Lorraine had been boasting about Trevor's accomplishments to a group of her friends when she suddenly turned to me and said, "Of course, Natalie here is just a freelance editor. Nothing too impressive, but at least she tries her best." I felt the weight of every eye on me as my face burned with humiliation. Erica smirked from across the room, clearly reveling in my discomfort. That night, I broke down in tears, confiding in my best friend Jane about the constant struggle I faced. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," I sobbed. "They make me feel like I'm worthless." Jane listened patiently, offering words of comfort and reassurance. "You're not worthless, Natalie," she said firmly. "You're a strong, capable woman who deserves to be treated with respect." Her words resonated with me, reminding me of the person I used to be before I let Erica and Lorraine's cruelty chip away at my self-worth. In that moment, I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue living like this, constantly walking on eggshells and being made to feel like an outsider in my own home. As I lay awake that night, my mind raced with possibilities. I had to find a way to reclaim my dignity and stand up to the toxic dynamic that threatened to consume me. And if Trevor wasn't willing to support me, then I would have to take matters into my own hands. After the humiliation I faced at the neighborhood gathering, things only seemed to escalate further at home. Erica's rebellious behavior spiraled out of control, and Lorraine's constant belittling became unbearable. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Erica stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. "Where's my favorite sweater?" she demanded. "I can't find it anywhere." "I'm not sure, honey," I replied calmly. "Did you check the laundry room?" "Of course I did," she snapped. "You probably lost it or ruined it with your incompetent washing." Before I could respond, Lorraine chimed in from the living room. "Honestly, Natalie, it's no wonder the girl is upset. You can't seem to do anything right around here." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "I'll take another look for the sweater after dinner, Erica. I'm sure it'll turn up." "Forget it," she spat. "You're useless." With that, she stormed out of the kitchen, slamming her bedroom door behind her. I stood there, my hands trembling as I fought back tears. How had things spiraled so out of control? I was trying my best, but it never seemed to be enough for them. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I found myself retreating into the world of my writing. It was the only place I felt truly at peace, where I could escape the constant barrage of criticism and belittlement. I poured my heart out onto the pages, documenting the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. The next day, I confided in Jane over coffee, sharing the latest incident with Erica and Lorraine. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," I admitted, my voice wavering. "They make me feel like I'm worthless." Jane listened intently, her brow furrowed with concern. "Natalie, you can't let them break you like this," she said firmly. "You're a strong, talented woman who deserves so much better." Her words resonated with me, reminding me of the person I used to be before I allowed myself to be consumed by their toxic behavior. I had always been a confident, independent woman, but somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of that. "You're right," I said, my resolve strengthening. "I can't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells and being made to feel inferior in my own home." Jane reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then don't," she said simply. "It's time to take a stand and reclaim your power." Her words ignited a spark within me, a determination to no longer be a victim of their cruelty. I knew that I had to find a way to break free from the toxic cycle, even if it meant making difficult choices. Over the next few weeks, I found myself retreating further into my writing, using it as a cathartic release for the emotions I had bottled up for so long. As the words flowed onto the page, I began to see a path forward, a way to reclaim my dignity and expose the truth about the dysfunction that had plagued my marriage. It was a risky move, one that could potentially burn bridges and upend my life as I knew it. But as I sat alone in my study, surrounded by the pages that had become my lifeline, I knew it was a risk I had to take. I couldn't continue living a lie, trapped in a world where I was constantly made to feel small and insignificant. With a newfound sense of purpose, I began to craft my story, weaving together the threads of deception that had been woven around me for far too long. It was time to take back control and show the world the true face of the family that had tried so hard to break me. It was a crisp autumn morning when my life took an unexpected and devastating turn. I was on my way to meet Jane for our weekly coffee date when a reckless driver ran a red light, slamming into the side of my car. The impact was jarring, and the next thing I knew, I was trapped in the crumpled wreckage, pain shooting through my left leg. I cried out, my vision blurring, as I fought to stay conscious. The paramedics arrived quickly, carefully extracting me from the mangled vehicle and rushing me to the hospital. As I lay on the gurney, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How could this have happened? Would I be okay? In the emergency room, the doctors delivered the devastating news. My leg had sustained severe injuries, and there was a possibility I might never walk unaided again. I felt the air leave my lungs as the weight of their words sank in, tears streaming down my face. When Trevor finally arrived, I expected him to be concerned for my well-being, to offer words of comfort and support. Instead, his first question was, "Will she still be able to take care of the household duties?" I stared at him in disbelief, my heart shattering at his callous indifference. In that moment, I realized that to him, I was nothing more than a means to an end. Someone to keep his home in order and cater to his every need. The following days were a blur of pain and emotional turmoil. As I lay in the hospital bed, struggling to come to terms with my new reality, Trevor's true colors became increasingly apparent. During one of his visits, he pulled out a stack of papers and placed them on my tray. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "With your condition, you're no longer useful to me or the family." I stared at the papers in horror, realizing they were pre-filled divorce documents. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, my eyes blurring with tears. "You can't be serious," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm afraid I am," Trevor replied matter-of-factly. "It's for the best, really. You'll be a burden on us in this state." In that moment, the weight of his betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. This was the man I had pledged my life to, the one I had sacrificed so much for in the hopes of building a happy family. And now, when I needed him the most, he was casting me aside like a broken toy. As he left the room, I could see the smug satisfaction on Lorraine's face. She had finally gotten what she wanted, me out of their lives for good. And Erica, emboldened by her father's actions, shot me a triumphant smirk, as if to say, "I told you so." In the days that followed, I found myself spiraling into a dark abyss of despair and anger. How could they treat me with such cruelty, such utter disregard for my well-being? After everything I had endured, after all the sacrifices I had made, this was how they repaid me? But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a newfound determination began to take root within me. I refused to be a victim any longer. If they wanted to cast me aside like a piece of garbage, then so be it. But I would not go down without a fight. The seeds of revenge had been planted, and I knew that no matter what it took, I would make them pay for their betrayal. They had underestimated my strength, my resilience, and they would soon learn the consequences of their actions. As I was discharged from the hospital, my parents welcomed me back into their home with open arms, offering the love and support I had been so desperately craving. It was there, surrounded by their unwavering kindness, that I began to heal. Not just physically, but emotionally as well. And as I regained my strength, day by day I knew that the time for retribution was drawing near. Trevor and his family had made a grave mistake in underestimating me, and they would soon learn that I was not a woman to be trifled with. Returning to my parents' home was like a soothing balm for my wounded soul. As I settled into the familiar surroundings, the warmth and unconditional love they provided began to slowly heal the deep cracks that had formed within me. My mother, Anna, was a constant source of comfort, tending to my needs with a gentle touch and a listening ear. She never once judged or criticized me for the decisions that had led me down this path. Instead, she offered her unwavering support, reminding me that I was strong and capable of overcoming any obstacle life threw my way. It was during those quiet moments, as I sat in the backyard garden that had been my childhood sanctuary, that I began to reflect on the depths of the betrayal I had endured. The more I thought about it, the more the anger and resentment bubbled to the surface. How could Trevor, the man who had vowed to love and cherish me, discard me so callously? And Lorraine and Erica, who had made it their mission to undermine me at every turn, now reveled in my misfortune, as if it were some twisted victory. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself poring over the memories, dissecting every interaction, every snide remark, every dismissive gesture. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I could finally see the true toxicity that had been festering within that household. It was during one of my weekly coffee dates with Jane that the seed of an idea began to take root. As I recounted the latest indignity I had suffered at the hands of my former family, Jane listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "Natalie," she said, her voice firm yet gentle, "you can't let them get away with this. You need to expose them for who they truly are." At first, the idea seemed daunting, even dangerous, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jane was right. I had spent too long living in the shadows, allowing their cruelty to diminish my sense of self-worth. It was time to take a stand and reclaim my power. With Jane's unwavering support and strategic guidance, I began to craft my story, a raw, unflinching account of the emotional abuse and manipulation I had endured. It was a cathartic process, each word a release of the pain and anger that had been festering within me. As the pages filled with the harsh truths of my former life, I found myself growing stronger, more resolute in my determination to seek justice. This was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure the same torment I had faced. With Jane's encouragement, I began to share my story with key figures in the community, people who had once respected and admired Trevor and his family. Their reactions were a mix of shock and outrage as the carefully constructed facade of their perfect household crumbled before their eyes. Word began to spread like wildfire, and soon my story was the talk of the town. I could feel the shift in the air, the way people looked at me with newfound respect and admiration for my courage in speaking out. But it wasn't just about garnering sympathy. It was about holding those who had wronged me accountable for their actions. As the truth came to light, the consequences began to unfold. Trevor's once thriving business began to suffer as clients and associates distanced themselves from him. Lorraine's social standing took a hit as her former friends turned their backs on her. And Erica, once the darling of the neighborhood, found herself ostracized by her peers. It was a bittersweet victory, to be sure. But as I sat in my parents' garden, basking in the warmth of the sun, I knew that I had finally reclaimed the power they had tried so desperately to strip away from me. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I was no longer the meek, downtrodden woman they had tried to break. I was a survivor, a warrior, and I was just getting started. 5 years had passed since I walked away from the toxic environment that had once been my home. In that time, I had rebuilt my life from the ashes, emerging as a strong, resilient woman with a newfound sense of purpose. My memoir, which had started as a cathartic release, quickly gained traction, resonating with countless others who had endured similar struggles. Before long, I found myself in demand as a speaker, sharing my story and advocating for women's rights and empowerment. It was a surreal experience, standing on stage and looking out at the sea of faces, all hanging on my every word. These were people who had once respected and admired Trevor and his family, who had bought into the carefully curated facade of their perfect household. Now, they saw the truth, the ugly, twisted reality that had been hidden behind closed doors. And instead of pity or judgment, they offered me their unwavering support, their admiration for the strength it took to break free from such a toxic environment. As my platform grew, so too did the consequences for Trevor, Lorraine, and Erica. Their once pristine reputation began to unravel, fraying at the seams as the harsh light of truth exposed their true colors. It started with whispers in the community, hushed conversations behind cupped hands. Then the whispers grew louder, until they could no longer be ignored. Trevor's business suffered as clients and associates distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the man who had so callously discarded his wife in her time of need. Lorraine's social standing took a hit as well, her former friends turning their backs on her, disgusted by the revelations of her cruelty and manipulation. And Erica, once the darling of the neighborhood, found herself ostracized by her peers, her rebellious behavior no longer seen as a youthful phase, but a symptom of a much deeper dysfunction. It was during this time of turmoil that they came crawling back to me, their desperation palpable. I remember the day vividly, the sharp rap on my door, echoing through the house like a harbinger of the confrontation to come. When I opened it, there they stood, Trevor, Lorraine, and Erica, their once proud demeanors replaced by a pathetic air of defeat. It was Lorraine who spoke first, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Natalie, we need your help," she said, her eyes darting nervously. "Things have been difficult since your little book came out." I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh at the irony of her words. "Difficult? You have no idea what true difficulty is." Trevor stepped forward then, his face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there before. "Please, Natalie," he pleaded, "we're in a bad way financially. Erica's struggling in school, and Lorraine's spending has gotten out of control. We need your support." For a moment I was tempted to take the high road, to offer them a lifeline and prove that I was the bigger person. But then I remembered the pain, the humiliation, the utter disregard they had shown me when I was at my lowest. "You're asking for my help?" I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "After everything you put me through? After casting me aside like a piece of garbage when I needed you the most?" Erica opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand, silencing her. "No, you don't get to talk. You've had your say, and now it's my turn." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the words I had longed to say for so many years. "You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. I won't be your savior, not after the way you treated me. You're reaping what you've sown, and I won't lift a finger to help you." Their faces fell, a mixture of disbelief and anger etched into their features. But I didn't care. In that moment, I felt a sense of power, of vindication, that I had never experienced before. "You underestimated me," I continued, my voice rising with each word. "You thought you could break me, but you were wrong. I am stronger than you ever imagined, and I will not let your toxic behavior poison my life any longer." With that, I turned and walked back into my home, closing the door firmly behind me. As I leaned against the solid oak, I could hear their muffled voices on the other side, a cacophony of anger and disbelief. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free from their manipulation, their cruelty, their oppressive hold over me. I had reclaimed my power, and nothing they could say or do would ever take that away from me again. The aftermath of my confrontation with Trevor, Lorraine, and Erica was like a shockwave rippling through our once idyllic community. As the truth of their actions came to light, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. Trevor's once thriving business took a nosedive as clients and associates distanced themselves from the man who had so callously discarded his wife in her time of need. Contracts were terminated, partnerships dissolved, and before long, he found himself struggling to keep the company afloat. Lorraine's social standing was equally decimated. The women who had once fawned over her at neighborhood gatherings now turned their backs, whispering behind cupped hands about her cruelty and manipulation. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and she found herself ostracized from the very circles she had once ruled with an iron fist. Even Erica, once the darling of the neighborhood, was not spared the consequences of her actions. Her peers, who had once admired her rebellious streak, now saw it for what it truly was, a symptom of a much deeper dysfunction. She became a pariah, shunned and ridiculed for the role she had played in my mistreatment. As for me, I watched it all unfold with a sense of vindication, a feeling that justice had finally been served. For too long, I had been the one made to feel small and insignificant, forced to endure their cruelty and manipulation in silence. But now the tables had turned. The carefully constructed facade they had built had crumbled, exposing the ugly truth that lay beneath. And as their lives unraveled before their very eyes, I stood tall, emboldened by the knowledge that I had reclaimed my power. It was a bittersweet victory, to be sure. A part of me still felt a twinge of sadness at the thought of what could have been. A happy, loving family, free from the toxicity that had poisoned our relationships. But that dream had died long ago, buried beneath the weight of their betrayal. As the weeks turned into months, the whispers and gossip began to die down, replaced by a newfound respect for the woman who had dared to speak her truth. I became a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for others who had endured similar struggles. My memoir, once a cathartic release, had become a rallying cry, inspiring countless others to find their own voices and break free from the chains of emotional abuse and manipulation. And as my platform grew, so too did my sense of purpose. I was no longer content to simply share my story. I wanted to use my newfound influence to effect real change, to advocate for those who had been silenced and marginalized. I began speaking at events, sharing my experiences, and offering guidance to others who found themselves in similar situations. I became a mentor, a confidant, a source of strength for those who had been beaten down by the cruelty of others. And through it all, Jane remained by my side, her unwavering support and strategic guidance helping me navigate the often treacherous waters of public life. She was my rock, my anchor, the one constant in a world that had once been so uncertain. As for Trevor, Lorraine, and Erica, their lives continued to spiral downward, a testament to the consequences of their actions. They had gambled everything on their ability to manipulate and control, and in the end, they had lost. I would be lying if I said I didn't take a certain amount of satisfaction in their downfall. After all, they had brought it upon themselves, sowing the seeds of their own destruction through their cruelty and disregard for others. But as time passed, that satisfaction began to fade, replaced by a sense of closure and a newfound appreciation for the life I had built for myself. I had overcome the greatest challenge of my life, emerging stronger and more resilient than ever before. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that my journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be righted, and voices to be amplified. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly empowered, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, I had proven that no matter how dark the night may seem, the light of truth and resilience will always find a way to shine through. The years that followed my confrontation with Trevor, Lorraine, and Erica were a whirlwind of personal growth and self-discovery. As the dust settled on that chapter of my life, I found myself embracing a newfound sense of purpose and determination. My memoir had struck a chord with countless others who had endured similar struggles, and before long, I was inundated with requests to share my story on a larger stage. What had started as a cathartic release had blossomed into a platform for advocacy and empowerment. I began speaking at events, sharing my experiences, and offering guidance to those who found themselves trapped in toxic relationships or oppressive family dynamics. It was a humbling experience to see the impact my words could have on others, to witness the spark of hope ignite in their eyes as they realized they were not alone. Through it all, Jane remained my steadfast companion, offering her unwavering support and strategic guidance as I navigated the often treacherous waters of public life. She was my rock, my confidant, and I knew that without her, I would never have found the strength to stand tall in the face of adversity. As my influence grew, so too did my commitment to effecting real change. I became involved in various women's rights organizations, using my voice to amplify the stories of those who had been silenced for far too long. It was during this time that I received a call from Jane, her voice brimming with pride and a sense of closure. "Natalie," she said, "do you remember when we first started this journey? When you were at your lowest point and the idea of seeking justice seemed like a distant dream?" I smiled, nodding even though she couldn't see me. "Of course I do. It feels like a lifetime ago." "Well, look at you now," she continued. "You've become a beacon of hope for so many others, a living embodiment of resilience and strength. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Her words filled me with a warmth that radiated from the depths of my soul. To have come so far, to have overcome such adversity, and emerged not only unbroken but stronger than ever before, it was a testament to the power of the human spirit. In the years that followed, I continued to pour my energy into my advocacy work, using my platform to shine a light on the often overlooked struggles of women in marginalized communities. But through it all, I never lost sight of the journey that had brought me to this point. It was on a crisp autumn day, the leaves painting the world in vibrant hues of red and gold, that I found myself standing before the graves of my parents. As I traced the weathered letters of their names with my fingertips, a sense of peace washed over me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "Thank you for giving me the strength to persevere, for being the unwavering pillars of support that I so desperately needed." In that moment, I knew that my journey had come full circle. I had faced the darkest depths of despair and emerged victorious, my spirit forged in the fires of adversity. And as I looked towards the future, I felt a sense of purpose and determination that burned brighter than ever before. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be righted, and voices to be amplified. But I knew that I was ready, armed with the knowledge that I had already overcome the greatest challenge of my life. As I turned and walked away from the graves, the autumn sun casting a warm glow upon my face, I couldn't help but smile. For in that moment, I realized that my story was not one of revenge or bitterness, but of resilience and triumph. I had reclaimed my power, my dignity, and my sense of self-worth, and in doing so, I had become a beacon of hope for others, a living embodiment of the truth that no matter how dark the night may seem, the light of perseverance will always find a way to shine through.